At the age of 32, he wept, not because there were no worlds left to conquer, but because he finally realized that conquest was never the answer. Alexander the Great, a name that has echoed through 23 centuries. But what if everything you thought you knew about him was wrong? What if his greatest lesson came not from his victories, but from his failures? Tonight, we trace the full arc of a life that burned too brightly, too quickly. A man who conquered most of the known world in just 13 years. A man hailed as a god. A man who killed his closest friend. We must ask, what can someone who conquered the world teach us about ambition, power, and the price of glory? The answer may unsettle you. For Alexander's story is not about how to succeed, but about how success can destroy you if you do not know when to stop. Let me start with some figures. In his 32 years of life, Alexander conquered over 2 million square miles of territory. His empire stretched from Greece to India, and from Egypt to Central Asia. He was never defeated on the battlefield. He founded more than 70 cities, most of which he named after himself, but none of these are the real reason he matters. Alexander matters because he changed the way humanity thinks about civilization itself. Before him, the world was fragmented. The Greeks saw the Persians as barbarians. The Persians viewed the Greeks as troublemakers. The East was East, and the West was West, and never the twain shall meet. Alexander asked, why not? He envisioned a world where Greek philosophy merged with Persian traditions, where soldiers intermarried with the conqueror, and cultures converged like rivers rather than being divided like walls. This idea was radical in the 4th century BCE. In some ways, it remains radical today, but there was a problem. He sought to realize this dream with a sword. He attempted to impose harmony by force. And when you build a utopia through violence, what you get is not paradise. You get idealism drenched in blood. Let me take you back to the mid-4th century BCE. Greece was not a unified nation. It was a collection of dozens of city-states. Athens, Sparta, Thebes, Corinth, each considering itself the center of the world. Each perpetually ready to wage war against its neighbors. They shared a language, gods, and the Olympic Games. But they did not share a government. They did not share trust. Look eastward, and you'll see the Persian Empire. It has reigned for 2 centuries, stretching from modern-day Turkey to Pakistan, boasting the world's finest roads, wealthiest cities, and largest army. Persia was an invincible monster in the eyes of the Greeks. A century and a half ago, Persia invaded Greece, burning Athens to the ground. Though the Greeks repelled them at Marathon and Salamis, the fear never truly faded. Persia became the monster Greek mothers invoked to frighten their children in the dark of night. Then came Macedonia. If you had asked an Athenian in 350 BC what Macedonia was, they would have scoffed. Macedonia. Those northern barbarians. Those mountain folk who barely spoke Greek. They weren't considered true Greeks, but Macedonia had a king named Philip II. He had only one eye, lost to an arrow in battle, and he walked with a limp, his leg wounded in another fight. His body was a map of scars, each telling a story of how he refused to die. Philip had a plan. He intended to unite the Greek city-states. Then he aimed to do the unthinkable, invade Persia. Most people thought it was madness, but Philip had a secret weapon, one he had been training for 18 years. His son, Alexander. Before we delve into the story, let me share what you will learn from Alexander's life. You will discover that the greatest barrier to achievement is often the assumption that something is impossible. Throughout his life, Alexander proved the experts wrong. He crossed rivers others deemed impassable, conquered fortresses declared impregnable, and with 10,000 men, he defeated armies of 100,000. But you will also learn that there is a fine line between refusing to accept limits and denying reality. You will see how leadership inspires people to follow you into hell, and what happens when you stop listening to them. You will learn how the dream of cultural fusion was centuries ahead of its time, and why it cannot be imposed by force. You will discover how power corrupts, not by turning you evil, but by isolating you until the only voice you hear is the echo of your own. Above all, you will come to understand this. You may conquer the entire world, but if you cannot conquer yourself, your anger, your pride, your insatiable need to prove yourself right, then all your conquests are meaningless. Alexander died at the age of 32. His empire began to crumble while his body was still warm. But his lessons about ambition and arrogance, about dreams and delusions, about what you lose in the pursuit of greatness, these lessons are timeless. So let us begin at the beginning. Not with his conquest of the world, but with his days as a boy. This story begins with fire, with betrayal, with a night when a 9-year-old boy learned his first lesson about power. It tolerates no rivals. She claimed that Alexander was not the son of Philip, but of Zeus. She danced with snakes in rituals, worshipping Dionysus, the god of wine. She told the young Alexander that divine blood flowed in his veins, and that he was destined to achieve what mortals could not. Imagine being told repeatedly as a child that you were a god. Would you believe it? Alexander did, or at the very least, he learned how to wield that story. For what he inherited from his mother was not merely ambition, it was the power of narrative. She claimed that Alexander was not the son of Philip, but of Zeus. She danced with snakes in rituals, worshipping Dionysus, the god of wine. She told the young Alexander that divine blood flowed in his veins, and that he was destined to achieve what no mortal could. Imagine being told repeatedly as a child that you were a god. Would you believe it? Alexander did. Or at least, he learned how to wield that story, for what he inherited from his mother was not merely ambition. He grasped the power of narrative. If Olympias gave him myth, Philip gave him reality. Philip II did not believe in gods. He believed in the phalanx. At 12 years old, Alexander stood by the training ground, watching his father drill the army. The Macedonian phalanx was a work of art. Soldiers stood in tight rows, each holding an 18-foot-long spear. From the front, it resembled a wall of spears. Attack it from the side, and it would pivot like a machine. Philip had turned warfare into a science. He did not rely on heroism. He relied on discipline, training, and tactics. Alexander watched and learned. He learned that courage could overcome numbers. He learned that fear was a weapon as real as the sword. He learned that soldiers would die for a general who knew what he was doing. But his relationship with his father was complex. Philip was proud of his son, yet also feared him. The boy was too clever, too ambitious, too much like his mother. And Olympias never let Alexander forget. Philip had other sons. If he wished, he could choose another heir. Trust did not exist in this family, only rivalry. When Alexander was 13, Philip did something extraordinary. He hired the world's greatest philosopher to tutor his son, Aristotle. They met in Mysa, a tranquil retreat, far from the intrigues of the royal court. There, amidst olive trees and marble columns, Aristotle instructed Alexander in philosophy, science, medicine, and literature. But he also imparted something far more perilous: the conviction of Greek cultural superiority. Aristotle taught that Greeks were inherently superior to barbarians, that Greek civilization was the beacon of the world, and that spreading Hellenic culture to barbarian lands was not merely a right but a duty. Alexander absorbed it all, but his greatest love was Homer's Philiad, the story of Achilles, the mightiest warrior who chose a short but glorious life over a long and obscure one. Alexander kept a copy of the Philiad, Phay under his pillow. He saw himself as a new Achilles, and his best friend, Hephaestion, was his Patroclus. But there is a lesson here we must note. Aristotle gave Alexander the tools of knowledge, but he also gave him a dangerous worldview. Believing your culture is superior to others can fuel great ambition, but it can also justify terrible atrocities. Alexander would struggle with this tension for the rest of his life. In 338 BC, Alexander was 18 years old. Philip decided it was time to unify Greece. Athens and Thebes formed an alliance to stop him. The two sides met at Paranoia. This would be the decisive battle. Philip placed his 18-year-old son in command of the Macedonian left flank. This was not an honorary position. It was a test, because the sacred band of Thebes, 150 pairs of lovers, warriors, sworn to stand together until death, would charge directly at Alexander's flank. The sacred band had never been defeated. They did not retreat. They did not surrender. They fought to the death. When the sacred band charged, Alexander did not confront them head-on. He did what his father had taught him. He employed tactics. His cavalry flanked them, striking at their unprotected sides where shields offered no defense. It was a massacre. 300 Theban warriors fell, not one fled, not one begged for mercy. They died side by side, just as they had sworn to do. After the battle, Alexander stood amidst the bodies. It is said he wept not for victory, but out of respect for enemies who had fought with such courage. The first crucial lesson we learn from the young Alexander is this: courage without strategy is merely beautiful suicide. The soldiers of the sacred band were exceptionally brave, yet they lost because Alexander was wiser. He understood that victory lies not in how brave you are, but in how you fight. But he also learned to respect enemies who fought for something greater than gold. This respect would surface time and again in his later conquests. He could be ruthless, yet he understood honor. After Paranoia, Greece submitted. Philip was now the master of Greece. At last, he could turn eastward toward his true goal, Persia. But he would never reach it. For at a wedding, at the pinnacle of his glory, someone waited in the crowd, a dagger in hand. In 336 BC, Philip held a wedding for his daughter at Aige. It was a grand celebration, attended by every prominent figure in Greece. Philip intended to display his power and confidence, so as he entered the theater, he left his guards behind, and he walked in alone, a king so mighty that he needed no protection. Pausanias, one of the guards, emerged from behind a pillar. Before anyone could scream, the dagger had already pierced Philip's ribs. The greatest king of Macedonia, the man who conquered Greece and forged the finest army in history, met his end at his daughter's wedding, slain by one of his own guards. Pausanias attempted to flee, but was pursued and killed on the spot. All too convenient, isn't it? A dead assassin tells no tales. Three parties stood to gain from Philip's death. His son, now the king, his wife Olympias, with her son's position secured, and Darius III, the king of Persia, whose most formidable adversary, had perished. Which one arranged the assassination? Historians have debated for 2,000 years. Did Alexander know? Probably not. Did he love his father? That is complicated. But one thing is certain. When the blade fell, Alexander was ready. At 20 years old, Alexander became the king of Macedon. But his troubles were just beginning, because as soon as the Greek city-states heard of Philip's death, they saw it as their chance. A boy king, they could overthrow Macedonian rule. Thebes publicly declared Alexander dead. It was a test, and Alexander responded in a way that would echo for the next 300 years. When Thebes announced his death, Alexander led his army across 300 miles in just 13 days. His sudden appearance outside the city walls of Thebes stunned all of Greece. How had the boy moved so swiftly? How had he assembled his forces without anyone noticing? The Thebans abruptly realized they had made a terrible mistake. Alexander presented his terms: surrender and you shall be spared. They refused their second grave error. Over the course of the next 3 days, A message was sent throughout all of Greece. 6,000 Thebans were slain. 30,000 were sold into slavery. The city was razed to the ground. Every building, every temple, every wall was torn down except for one house. The house of the poet Pindar. Alexander ordered it to be spared. That was the message. I respect culture. I honor art. But I will not tolerate rebellion. This is the grim lesson we learn from the young Alexander. Sometimes, one overwhelming show of force can prevent 10 future uprisings. The destruction of Thebes was horrific, but it worked. For the next decade, not a single Greek city dared to defy Alexander. He realized that perception is a weapon. He understood that people respect what they fear, but he also paid a price. For the rest of his life, the ghosts of Thebes would haunt him. Greek philosophers would condemn him. Critics would call him a tyrant. Yet the Greek city-states remained silent. Now, at the age of 20, Alexander had completed the work his father began. Greece was unified. Now he could turn his gaze eastward toward the empire he had trained his whole life to conquer. Persia. But he faced a problem. The Persian Empire's army outnumbered his by 10 to 1. Its wealth was boundless. It had ruled for 2 centuries. No one believed Alexander could win. But Alexander had been told his entire life that he was the son of a god, and gods do not fail. In the spring of 334 BC, Alexander led 35,000 infantry and 5,000 cavalry across the Hellespont into Asia Minor. There was no turning back. He burned his ships, or so the legend goes. The message was clear. Forward was the only direction. Victory or death. No middle ground. The Persian satraps had assembled an army to confront him at the Granicus River. It was a shrewd position. The river ran chest-deep and swift. On the opposite side, steep banks loomed where the Persian cavalry waited, holding the high ground. Any army attempting to cross would struggle in the water only to be slaughtered while climbing the banks. Alexander's generals pleaded with him to wait, to find another crossing, or at least delay until morning. Parmenion, his father's most seasoned commander, declared an immediate attack sheer madness. Alexander gazed across the river at the Persians. Then he did something that stunned everyone. He spurred his horse straight into the current. The companion cavalry followed him because they had no other choice. That was Alexander's way of leadership. He never asked his soldiers to do anything he wouldn't do himself. The river water surged against the horses' legs. Arrows rained down around them. As they reached the opposite bank, the Persian cavalry charged. It was a chaotic melee. Alexander's helmet was split by the battle axe of a Persian noble. Shards of metal flew. His life hung by a thread for but a second. Yet, Clytus, one of his father's seasoned veterans, severed the Persian's arm. Alexander was saved. The battle lasted less than an hour. The Persian line crumbled. They hadn't anticipated such madness. No one would cross a river directly into a defended position. But Alexander did. Alexander understood that at critical moments, a leader cannot ask others to bear risks he is unwilling to take himself. His soldiers followed him into the river not because of orders, but because he leaped in first. This inspired a loyalty that no ordinary command could ever evoke. Yet we also see the fine line between bravery and recklessness. Had Clytus been a second slower, Alexander would have perished in his very first major battle, and his entire legend would never have unfolded. Courage won that battle, but courage paired with luck. Remember that. The victory at the Granicus shook Asia Minor. Greek cities threw open their gates, welcoming Alexander as a liberator. Persian garrisons fled or surrendered. Within months, the entire coast of Asia Minor was under his control. But this was only the beginning. The true test still lay ahead. During his eastward campaign, Alexander arrived at the ancient Phrygian city of Gordium. There, in the temple, lay a famous knotter tangle, so intricate that no one had ever managed to untie it. Legend held that whoever unraveled the Gordian knot would rule all of Asia. Over the centuries, countless had tried. Kings, philosophers, charlatans, all had failed. The knot was impossibly complex, so tightly wound that neither its beginning nor its end could be discerned. Alexander entered the temple, surrounded by priests, soldiers, and locals eager to witness whether the young conqueror could achieve what none had in centuries. He stood before the knot, studying it, not for hours, not for minutes, but for about a minute. Then, drawing his sword, he sliced it cleanly, in two with a single stroke. The room fell into a dead silence. Then, someone began to cheer. The priests debated whether it counted, but Alexander had already left because he grasped what others failed to see. The knot was not the problem. The knot was the trap. It made you assume there was only one path to success, through patience and conventional wisdom. Alexander rejected that premise. He didn't play by others' rules. He created his own. This is one of the most powerful lessons we learn from Alexander. When everyone tells you something is impossible, don't just doubt their answers, question their question. Perhaps the entire framework is flawed. Perhaps the very rules that lead you to failure are the obstacle itself. But note the subtle distinction here. Alexander didn't solve the problem. He eliminated it. Is this genius or cheating? It depends on whom you ask. Traditionalists say he broke the rules. Pragmatists say the rules were foolish. Alexander would say the outcome is all that matters. When you face an impossible challenge, ask yourself, am I playing someone else's game? What if I change the game itself? Sometimes the greatest innovation isn't solving a problem better, but making the problem irrelevant. News of the Gordian knot spread throughout the Persian Empire. This young king was not only brave, he was clever. He thought differently. He didn't play by the rules to the Persian court. This should have been a warning. But Darius III, the king of Persia, wasn't worried. He had 600,000 soldiers. Alexander had 40,000 numbers. Don't lie. Or do they? In the autumn of 333 BC, Alexander advanced eastward through the Cilician gates. His scouts brought an improbable message. King Darius III of Persia himself was leading a massive army right behind them, not ahead. But behind, Darius had cut off their retreat. The Macedonian forces were trapped between the mountains and the sea, facing an army far larger than their own. Alexander's generals turned pale. It was a catastrophe. They were surrounded. Yet Alexander laughed. He actually laughed. Why? Because Darius had made a fatal mistake. He had chosen to fight on the narrow plain of Iasus, hemmed in by mountains and the sea. On an open plain, the Persian numerical superiority would have overwhelmed the Macedonians. But in such confined terrain, Darius could not deploy all his forces. Numbers became irrelevant. Alexander had turned it into a battle of skill against skill, and in skill, he knew he was superior. At the onset of the battle, Darius sought to overwhelm the Macedonians with his numerical superiority. The Persian infantry clashed against the Macedonian phalanx, yet the formation held its ground, its long spears piercing any who drew near. Darius launched his chariots in a charge, but the Macedonians, well-drilled, parted ways to let the chariots surge through, only to eliminate their drivers from behind. Then Alexander spotted what he had been waiting for, a gap in the Persian line, right where Darius stood. Positioned on his chariot, clad in purple and gold, surrounded by his royal guard. Darius was the heart of the entire Persian army. Alexander did not aim to defeat the entire force. He targeted the king. Leading his companion cavalry, he drove straight for that breach in a wedge formation, designed to shatter the enemy line and plunge deep into their ranks. The Persian guards attempted to halt them, but Alexander proved unstoppable. His spear aimed directly at Darius, with only a few dozen yards separating the two. This could have been a historic duel, but Darius did something that would define him forever. He fled. The king of the Persian Empire, the wealthiest man in the world, turned and ran at the sight of Alexander charging toward him. His chariot sped eastward, leaving his army in disarray. As the soldiers witnessed their king's flight, their morale shattered. The Persian lines crumbled, with troops discarding their weapons and scrambling for their lives. The battle turned into a pursuit, as the Macedonians chased the fleeing Persians for miles. By nightfall, tens of thousands of Persian soldiers lay dead, while Alexander suffered minimal losses. But what truly changed everything was what Alexander found in the abandoned camp of Darius. Darius had fled in such haste that he left everything behind: his treasures, his tents, and even his family. His mother, Sisygambis, by name, his wife, Statira, his 2 daughters, and his son, all became captives of Alexander. This was a pivotal moment that revealed something crucial about Alexander's character. He could have humiliated them. He could have enslaved them. He could have done all the terrible things conquerors typically did to the families of their enemies. Instead, he provided them with royal accommodations, allowed them to keep their servants and possessions, and treated them with respect. It is said that when Sisygambis first met Alexander, she knelt before Hephaestion, mistaking him for the king because he was taller. When she realized her mistake, she was ashamed, but Alexander reassured her, saying, "It is all right, for he too is Alexander." This is the lesson. Alexander understood that how you treat the defeated determines how the next enemy will fight. If you are cruel, every city will fight to the last person, because surrender means death. But if you show mercy, cities will open their gates, as surrender becomes an option rather than a death sentence. This isn't just kindness, it's strategy. Mercy can be a weapon, just like fear. And when wielded skillfully, it's even more effective. But here lies the complexity. Was Alexander truly merciful? Or was he just adept at using mercy as a tool? Did he genuinely care for these Persian women? Or did he understand that treating them well would make Darius look worse for having abandoned them? We may never know for sure. Perhaps even Alexander himself didn't. Maybe mercy and manipulation can coexist. Perhaps the greatest leaders are those whose genuine compassion aligns with strategic calculation. After Isis, Alexander gained control of the entire eastern Mediterranean coast. Darius fled back into the Persian heartland, shamed and broken. He offered peace, proposing to cede half of the Persian Empire and the hand of his daughter in marriage. But Alexander refused. He didn't want half an empire. He wanted it all. On his march toward Egypt, Alexander encountered an obstacle: the city of Tyre. This Phoenician city was built on an island half a mile off the coast. It boasted towering walls, a powerful navy, and ample supplies. It had never been conquered. Alexander demanded their surrender. The Tyrians mocked him from the walls. How would you attack an island without a navy? Swim there. Alexander's generals advised bypassing Tyre. The city wasn't worth the time. Let it remain isolated in the sea. But Alexander saw something else. If he bypassed Tyre, everyone would think it was because he couldn't capture it. It would become a crack in his myth of invincibility. So he did something insane. If he couldn't sail to the island, he would walk there. He decided to build a bridge across the sea. His engineers thought he was mad, yet they set to work. They dismantled stones from the old city of Tyre. They felled trees for pillars. They began constructing a causeway in the sea, 1 foot at a time. At first, the Tyrians found it amusing. They mocked the foolish Macedonians for trying to conquer the sea. But as the causeway grew longer, their laughter ceased. They began to fight back. Archers shot arrows at the workers. Catapults hurled stones. Alexander erected towers to shield his men. The Tyrians built fireships, loaded them with combustibles, and steered them into the towers. The towers burned to ashes. Weeks of labor went up in flames. Alexander started over. This went on for 7 months. 7 months of building, fighting, burning, and rebuilding. Alexander's soldiers began to doubt, was it worth it? But Alexander refused to retreat. Here we observe a recurring pattern in Alexander's life. When told something was impossible, he took it as a personal affront. His ego would not allow him to accept defeat. This drive could spur astonishing accomplishments, yet it also bred obsession. A 7-month siege of a city that could have been bypassed, was it strategy or vanity? The answer lies in both. Ultimately, Alexander's causeway reached the island. He secured a fleet from Cyprus and launched a combined assault on Tyre by sea and land. The walls were breached. When his soldiers finally stormed the city, driven mad by months of frustration, a massacre ensued. 8,000 Tyrian defenders were slaughtered, 30,000 were sold into slavery, and 2,000 surviving combatants were crucified along the shoreline. Alexander allowed it all to unfold. This is a crucial learning point. Here we see the gap between Alexander's philosophical ideals and the brutal reality of maintaining power. He envisioned a unified world where Greeks and Persians stood as equals, yet he could not prevent the violence required to achieve that unity. The siege of Tyre reveals this contradiction. He engineered marvels, demonstrating incredible determination and innovation. But the ultimate victory came through mass slaughter. Can you forge peace with a sword? Alexander spent his life attempting to answer this question. Spoiler, the answer is no. But he never learned this lesson. The causeway to Tyre still exists today. After 2 millennia, it has become a permanent land bridge. Tyre is no longer an island. Alexander literally altered geography. But at what cost? Setting out from Tyre, Alexander marched south into Egypt. For 2 centuries, Egypt had groaned under Persian dominion. The Persians had suppressed Egyptian religion, plundered its riches, and treated it as a colony rather than a civilization. Thus, when Alexander arrived, he was welcomed not as a conqueror but as a liberator. The Egyptian priests proclaimed him Pharaoh, son of Amun-Ra, a living god. This marked a turning point. In Greece, Alexander was a king. In Macedonia, a military commander. In Persia, a conqueror. But in Egypt, for the first time, he was formally declared a deity. He could have laughed it off. He could have rejected the title, insisting he was merely mortal. Instead, he embraced it. Why? Partly for political reasons. The Egyptians needed a god-king. By accepting the role, Alexander legitimized his rule. Yet there was something more. I believe Alexander began to believe it himself, or at the very least, he wanted to. He did something that spoke volumes. He journeyed across the desert to the Siwa oasis, home to the Oracle of Ammon. It was a perilous trek. The desert could kill. Yet Alexander insisted on going. Why? He wanted to hear from the gods who he truly was. His biographers recount miracles along the way. When his party lost their path, ravens guided them to the oasis. When their water ran out, rain suddenly fell. Are these tales true? Likely not. But what matters is that they were told. Alexander's life was increasingly enveloped in myth, and he encouraged these legends. At Siwa, he entered the temple alone, accompanied only by the priests. What transpired inside, he never fully disclosed. But when he emerged, something in his eyes had changed. This is where we witness the intertwining of Alexander's genius and tragedy. He understood that people needed more than just a military commander. They needed symbols, stories, and beliefs to hold on to. By becoming a living god, he gave them precisely that. He forged a foundation of loyalty that transcended military might, a stroke of brilliance. Yet, herein lies the problem. When you become a deity to others, do you start believing it yourself? When an entire civilization kneels before you, can humility endure? Alexander found it increasingly difficult. Starting in Egypt, he began demanding divine treatment, first there, then elsewhere. His Macedonian soldiers, those who had grown up alongside him, grew uneasy. They remembered him as Philip's son, a boy who could bleed. But now he demanded worship. This tension would fester over the years, culminating in tragedy. Before leaving Egypt, Alexander did something that would outlast all his battles. He founded a city on the Mediterranean coast, Alexandria. It would become one of the greatest cities of the ancient world. Its library would house 500,000 scrolls. Its lighthouse would be one of the 7 wonders of the world. In the centuries after Alexander's death, the city would become a center of learning, science, and culture. Euclid would write his geometry there. Archimedes' ideas would spread from there. Here lies the irony. Alexander founded over 70 cities, but only one truly mattered. And that city's legacy was not military. It was intellectual. Perhaps that is the real lesson. Military conquests fade. Empires crumble. But the exchange of ideas, learning, and culture endures. What Alexander unintentionally created proved more valuable than anything he deliberately conquered. Had he understood this, he might have lived differently. But he had no time for reflection, for Darius was gathering his final army in the east. This time, it would be the decisive battle. In the autumn of 331 BC, Darius chose his battlefield, Gaugamela, in what is now northern Iraq. It was a vast plain, perfectly suited for his chariots and cavalry. He had spent months preparing, even ordering workers to level the ground and clear away any rocks or vegetation that might obstruct his chariots. His army represented everything the Persian Empire could muster. The numbers are debated, but sources suggest perhaps 100,000 or more. War elephants, scythed chariots, cavalry from every corner of the empire, and the finest Persian infantry. This was Darius' final chance. If he lost here, the empire would fall. Alexander, by contrast, commanded about 47,000 men, facing odds of nearly 2 to 1, possibly worse. On the eve of the battle, Alexander's officers paced nervously. They could see the countless campfires of the Persian army twinkling like stars in the distance. Yet Alexander slept so soundly that they had to wake him the next morning for the battle. Parmenion asked how he could rest so peacefully. Alexander replied, "Darius has finally stopped running. Now I can settle this." It was pure psychological warfare. His soldiers saw him so confident that he slept before what would become one of history's greatest battles. If their king showed no concern, why should they worry? In truth, Alexander might have spent the night planning, but he projected utter calm. That is leadership, not the absence of fear, but the mastery of its display. At the onset of the battle, Darius unleashed his secret weapon, scythed chariots, equipped with rotating blades on their wheels, designed to cut through infantry. 100 of these chariots thundered toward the Macedonian lines. It should have been terrifying, but Alexander had trained his men to prepare for this very tactic. As the chariots closed in, the phalanx opened up lanes, allowing them to pass through harmlessly. Then, the Macedonian soldiers struck the drivers from the sides with javelins. The out-of-control chariots wreaked havoc within the Persian ranks. Darius' secret weapon had turned into a disaster. Yet, the Persian numerical advantage began to tell. Their cavalry encircled the Macedonian flanks, and Parmenion's left wing found itself in dire straits. A messenger wrote to Alexander pleading for reinforcements. But Alexander sent none, for he had spotted the opportunity he had been waiting for. A gap in the Persian line not on the flanks. Right in the center, where Darius himself stood. This was his moment of tactical genius. He didn't try to defeat the Persians across the entire front. That was impossible. Instead, he aimed for the heart. Kill the king and the army would collapse. He rallied the companion cavalry, his finest warriors, his closest friends. He pointed toward the gap, and then they charged. It became one of the most famous cavalry charges in history. In a wedge formation, Alexander at its tip, they shot like a bullet into the Persian line. The Persian guards tried to hold them back. The fight turned into a chaotic melee. But Alexander's momentum was unstoppable. He drew closer and closer to Darius. Only a few yards separated the two men. Alexander could see Darius's face, and Darius could see Alexander. This should have been the duel that decided the fate of the empire. But Darius did what he had done at Is as he fled. His chariot wheeled around and sped eastward. He abandoned his army, his empire, and his honor. When the soldiers saw their king fleeing, morale completely collapsed. Everyone fought for themselves. The battle lines disintegrated, and the Persian army fell apart. The Macedonians pursued them for miles. By sunset, tens of thousands of Persian soldiers lay dead or captured, while Alexander's losses were minimal. Here is the crucial lesson we learned from Gaugamela at pivotal moments. Decapitation trumps attrition. Don't attempt to dismantle the entire system. Identify its linchpin and strike there. But we also gleaned something about leadership. Darius's soldiers fought for their king. Alexander's men fought for their faith in him. That marks the distinction between command and leadership. Darius commanded an army. Alexander led a movement. His soldiers believed in him, convinced of his invincibility. When he charged toward death, they followed, unable to conceive of his defeat. This belief was his most potent weapon, yet it would also become his greatest curse. For when people believe you are a god, how do you tell them to stop? How do you admit limitations? How do you say no? Alexander never learned to do so, and that would ultimately destroy him. After the Battle of Gaugamela, Alexander marched south. Babylon, one of the world's oldest cities, opened its gates to him. The Ishtar gate swung wide before him, its blue-glazed bricks shimmering in the sunlight. Priests showered him with flower petals, hailing him as the liberator and the king of kings. At 25, he was the master of the largest empire ever known. He stood in the palace where Hammurabi had once ruled, in the place where Nebuchadnezzar had built wonders. That night, in the palace where rulers had held sway for 1,000 years, Alexander could not sleep. Why? Because now he faced a problem no Macedonian had ever confronted: how to rule what he had conquered. Conquest is simple. You march, you fight, you win. But ruling, that's an entirely different challenge. Alexander possessed an empire stretching from Greece to the Indus River, dozens of languages, dozens of religions, Greeks, Persians, Egyptians, Babylonians, Jews. How did he hold it all together? By force. You can't occupy every city with an army forever. Then what? This is where Alexander embarked on his boldest experiment: cultural fusion. He began wearing Persian attire. He adopted Persian court customs. He started appointing Persian nobles as satraps. His Macedonian generals watched, growing increasingly uneasy. They hadn't fought for this. They fought to conquer the barbarians, not to become them. But Alexander saw something different. He saw that if he were just another conqueror, the empire would crumble after his death. But if he could blend East and West, creating a new culture, perhaps it would endure. It was radical, it was visionary, and it was doomed to fail, because you can't force cultural fusion. You can't command people to abandon their identity. But Alexander would try, and that attempt would estrange him from those closest to him. Setting out from Babylon, Alexander pressed onward eastward. His target was Persepolis, the ceremonial capital of the Persian Empire. Upon arrival, he was awestruck. The palace was a marvel: stone pillars, as tall as ship masts, walls carved with winged bulls, and reliefs depicting 2 centuries of tributes. The treasury overflowed with gold, wealth accumulated over generations. It stood as a symbol of Persian power, a monument to 200 years of conquest. Alexander permitted his soldiers to plunder the city, and they carried away unimaginable riches. Yet he ordered the palace itself to be spared. too magnificent to destroy, representing a civilization he claimed to respect. That should have been the end of the story. But a month later, at a banquet, everything changed. That evening, there was plenty of wine, far too much. Alexander and his companions were celebrating their victory. Someone, perhaps Thas the courtesan from Athens, suggested burning down the palace. The reason: revenge. 150 years earlier, the Persians had burned Athens. Now, it was time for payback. It was absurd. Those who had destroyed Athens had been dead for centuries, and Persepolis had nothing to do with Athens. But in that room, filled with drunken soldiers and the accumulated tension of battle, the idea caught fire literally. Alexander, drunk and blinded by glory, seized a torch. He led the way. They marched to the palace. Singing drunken songs, they set the curtains ablaze, then the wooden beams, then everything. By dawn, the symbol of the Persian Empire had turned to ashes. 2 centuries of art, irreplaceable history, destroyed in a single night. When Alexander sobered up, some say he wept. He saw what he had done. He had destroyed what he claimed to protect. He had acted like a barbarian, though he prided himself as a bearer of civilization. This is the crucial lesson we must heed. In moments of heated emotion, we can obliterate in minutes what took generations to build. Alexander the philosopher gave way to Alexander the drunken soldier. Leaders are human. The question is, what systems do you put in place to shield your mission from your worst self? Alexander had no such safeguards. He was surrounded by yes men and equally inebriated friends. No one stopped him, and so he obliterated history. The burning of Persepolis cast a long shadow over Alexander's legacy. His supporters argue it was a necessity of war. His critics claim it revealed his true nature. I believe both are right. Alexander was capable of envisioning a beautiful ideal of cultural harmony. Yet he was also capable of committing horrific atrocities under the influence of rage and alcohol. These two Alexanders coexisted, the philosopher and the destroyer, the idealist and the drunkard. Which was the real Alexander? Both. That is what makes him so complex, and the lesson of Persepolis is clear. What are your principles worth under pressure, under alcohol, under peer influence? If they vanish in such moments, they are not principles at all. They are merely ornaments of convenience. After the Battle of Gaugamela, Darius fled once again. He headed east into the heartland of Persia, hoping to regroup his forces there. Alexander pursued him, not for territory, as he already possessed the empire, but because he needed Darius to surrender. A dead rebel king was more valuable than a living, fleeing emperor. If Darius yielded, the transfer of power would be legitimate. If he continued to escape, the empire would remain on the brink. So Alexander gave chase, for months on end, across deserts and mountains. It became an obsession. But Darius's own men had a different calculation in mind. Bessus, the satrap of Bactria, looked upon his dying king and saw an opportunity. A living Darius was of little worth, but his corpse could serve as a bargaining chip. They stabbed Darius on a desolate road, then rode off, leaving him to die. When Alexander's scouts found him, the great king of Persia was still breathing. Accounts differ as to what happened next. Some say Alexander offered him water and vowed to hunt down his assassins. Others claim they never exchanged words. Either way, Darius died. Alexander wept, but what were those tears, sorrow or relief? Darius's death solved Alexander's problem. Now there was no Persian king to rally resistance against him. Yet he achieved this through murder rather than surrender. Alexander pursued and executed Bessus and the other assassins, branding them traitors and regicides. But he remained the ultimate beneficiary. This reveals Alexander's complex identity crisis. He mourned Darius while wearing his crown. He punished the assassins while benefiting from the murder. Here we learn that achieving one's goals sometimes requires dirty hands, and the price of empire is complicity in evils You did not directly commit. Alexander wanted a legitimate transfer of power. He obtained it, but through assassination, he wished to be seen as Darius' successor, not a usurper. He achieved this, yet it was built upon his enemy's betrayal by his own people. Can moral rule be established on a bloody foundation? Alexander attempted it. He gave Darius a royal funeral. He punished the killers. He showed respect to Persian nobles. But the Persians knew the truth, and the Macedonians began to suspect their king was becoming too Persian. Alexander was trapped between two worlds, never fully trusted by either side. After the death of Darius, Alexander continued his eastward advance into the mountainous regions of Central Asia, Bactria, and Sogdiana, modern-day Afghanistan, and Uzbekistan. The nature of warfare here was different. There were no grand-pitched battles, no phalanx clashing against phalanx. Instead, it was guerrilla warfare, ambushes, and hit-and-run tactics. Local warlords established strongholds in the mountains, raided Macedonian supply lines, and then vanished among the populace. Alexander was accustomed to defeating massive armies on open battlefields. But here, the enemy refused to meet him head-on. They struck and fled, blending seamlessly with civilians. He could not fight an enemy he could not see. This dragged on for 3 years of frustration, skirmishes, and ambushes. His soldiers began to question their purpose. Why were they in these desolate mountains? They had already conquered Persia, they already possessed the world. Why were they chasing mountain tribes? In the spring of 327 BC, Alexander the Great stood before the Sogdian Rock, a fortress perched atop sheer cliffs and deemed impregnable. The local warlord, Oxyates, had taken refuge there with his family and treasures. When Alexander demanded surrender, Oxyates mockingly shouted from the walls, "Send men with wings." It was a taunt. No army could scale those cliffs. Yet Alexander took it as a personal challenge. He offered rewards to volunteers willing to climb the cliffs under cover of darkness. 300 stepped forward, equipped with iron spikes and ropes. They ascended in the dark, the cliffs icy and the rock slick. 30 fell to their deaths, but by dawn the survivors reached the summit and waved their banners above the fortress. When Oxyates saw the banners flying above the city walls, he surrendered. Not because 300 men could defeat his garrison, but because of the psychological blow. If Alexander could accomplish this, what was beyond his reach? Yet, we must note the lesson here. By now, Alexander's pattern was clear. When told something was impossible, he took it as a personal insult. He had to prove everyone wrong. This drive could inspire astonishing feats. The scaling of the Sogdian Rock was truly impressive. But at what cost? 30 men died. For what? For a fortress he could have simply besieged until it surrendered. But that wouldn't have proven anything. That wouldn't have showcased his extraordinariness. So men perished. Also Alexander could achieve the impossible. This is the peril of a leader driven by the need to prove himself. Achievement becomes more important than its price. After conquering the Sogdian Rock, Alexander encountered the daughter of Oxyates, Roxana. She was said to be the most beautiful woman in Asia, which may well have been true. But more significant was what she represented. A symbol. By marrying her, Alexander sent a clear message. He was not merely conquering the East. He was becoming part of it. This was not an occupation force. It was integration. His generals watched the wedding with deep unease. They had not fought for 3 years in the mountains only to see their king wed a barbarian princess. Yet for Alexander, this was integral to his vision. Greeks and Persians united, Macedonians and Central Asians, as one a new world where birth no longer mattered, only merit. This is noble. This is visionary. Yet it also alienated his closest supporters. Parmenian's son Philotas grumbled in private to Craterus, and other veterans watched as their king donned Persian attire, married Persian women, and appointed Persians to high positions. They began to whisper that he was no longer Macedonian, that he had become the very people he had conquered. This is a crucial lesson we learn from Alexander. Integration demands more than policies. It requires personal commitment. To bridge cultures, you must embody that bridge in your own life. Alexander understood this. He wasn't just speaking of unity, he was living it. But herein lies the dilemma. Ideals can estrange allies. Those who helped you attain power may not share your vision for how that power should be wielded. How do you balance loyalty to those who helped you rise and loyalty to the vision you believe is right? Alexander increasingly chose the vision over the people. He trusted that his Macedonian veterans would eventually understand. But they did not. They felt betrayed. Their king had chosen Persians over them, and when soldiers feel betrayed, dangerous things begin to happen. Whispers turn into conspiracies. Discontent becomes mutiny, and Alexander, so focused on his grand vision, began to overlook the growing signs of disloyalty around him. Until one night, at a drunken banquet, all the tension erupted. That night would become the darkest moment of Alexander's life. That night, he would kill one of his closest friends. That night, he would cross a line from which there was no return. In the autumn of 328 BC, a banquet was held in Samarkand. It should have been a celebration, but the room was thick with unspoken tension. Wine flowed freely, too freely. Alexander, drunk, began to boast of his victories. He declared himself greater than his father. Philip, claiming his achievements, dwarfed Philip's conquests. Old Clytus had been drinking too, listening and seething. As one of Philip's oldest veterans, he had saved Alexander's life at the Granicus. He had watched Alexander grow from a boy into a man, and now he saw that boy clad in Persian robes, taking Persian wives, and proclaiming himself greater than the man who had conquered Greece. Clytus could no longer contain himself. "Do you think you are better than your father?" he muttered indistinctly. "Philip conquered Greece. You merely squander his wealth-chasing glory in the desert." The room fell into a dead silence. No one had ever spoken to Alexander like this. No one dared. But Clytus pressed on. "Philip!" Alexander's voice turned icy. "I am Philip. I am Philip. I am Macedonia. I am of Zeus' bloodline." "You are but a boy in Persian skirts." Clytus spat out the words. "Pretending to be a god. Others kneel only because you'd slay those who refuse." Alexander snatched a spear from a guard. A single thrust. Just like that, Clytus was dead before anyone could intervene. The man who had saved his life, the man who had served his father, the man who had known him since he was a boy, dead in a moment of rage. No one in the room moved. They stared at the king. They stared at the corpse. Alexander looked at his hands, at the spear, at what he had just done. Then he began to scream, not in anger, in horror. He screamed Clytus's name. He tried to turn the spear on himself. The guards had to restrain him. They dragged him to his tent. He locked the door. For 3 days, Alexander locked himself in his tent. He refused food, refused water. Some said he attempted suicide. His soldiers waited outside, fearing the campaign might end there, that grief would destroy what the Persian army could not. Philosophers and priests were summoned. They told him it wasn't his fault, that it was the will of the gods, that Clytus was fated to die. But Alexander knew the truth. It wasn't fate. It was his rage, his ego, his inability to tolerate being questioned. He had killed a man for speaking the truth. He had killed a friend. On the 4th day he appeared gaunt, broken, but alive. He offered no defense for himself. He did not blame Clytus. He took responsibility. Yet the damage was done. This was Alexander's darkest lesson. Absolute power, combined with alcohol, ego, and the absence of honest voices, led to an irreversible tragedy. Clytus was right. Alexander had changed. The boy who studied philosophy had become a tyrant who killed the truth-teller. Here we learn that success without accountability is a path to self-destruction. Alexander needed people like Clytus. He needed those who would say no to him. He needed those who would argue with him when he was wrong. But he killed that man. After Clytus, Alexander was never the same again. He grew paranoid. He began to see conspiracies everywhere. He executed Philotas, his cavalry commander, accusing him of plotting rebellion. The evidence was flimsy, but Alexander no longer required solid proof. Suspicion alone sufficed. Then he sent assassins to kill Parmenion, Philotas's father, his own oldest general, a man who had served Macedon for 40 years. Parmenion was hundreds of miles away, unaware of his son's fate. The assassins struck him down in his own tent. The army of brothers was devouring itself. The generals no longer trusted one another. Everyone feared being next. And Alexander, seated at the center, was tormented by his own fears and guilt. This is a crucial lesson on how power corrupts. It doesn't corrupt by turning you evil. It corrupts by isolating you. After killing Clytus, no one dared to speak the truth to Alexander anymore. Everyone agreed with him, not because he was right, but because opposing him could be fatal. Thus, he was surrounded by flatterers and cowards. The only voice he heard was the echo of his own. And when the only sound around you is your own echo, you go mad. You begin to believe your own propaganda. You start thinking you truly are a god. You lose the ability to distinguish truth from flattery, criticism from treason, friendship from threat. Alexander was losing this ability. He became a dangerous leader, not because he was weak, but because he was too powerful for anyone to restrain. The ghost of Clytus will forever haunt Alexander. For the rest of his life, he will see that face in his dreams. He will hear those words, "You are a boy pretending to be a god." Perhaps Clytus was right. Perhaps Alexander truly lost himself. In the process of conquering the world, he lost what made him human: his compassion, his sense of humor, his ability to listen, his willingness to admit mistakes. These qualities vanished one by one, replaced by arrogance, paranoia, and delusions of divinity. But here lies the complexity. Perhaps those qualities had to vanish for him to achieve what he did. Maybe one cannot conquer the world and remain humble. Perhaps the scale of such an achievement demands a certain degree of delusion. If Alexander had paused to reflect, if he had said, "All right, I've conquered Persia, that is enough," then Clytus might still be alive. Parmenion might still be alive. His friendships might have remained intact, but he would not have become Alexander the Great. He would merely have been Alexander, a successful conqueror. So this is the bargain: greatness in exchange for humanity, achievement in exchange for relationships, legend in exchange for the soul. Alexander made that bargain. The problem is, he didn't realize he was making it. He thought he could have both. He believed he could become a god and remain human. But you can't. Eventually, you must choose. And Alexander, through his actions, chose greatness over goodness, time and again. Starting from Central Asia, this pattern will only intensify. He will continue his eastward advance into India, securing more improbable victories. Yet, he will grow increasingly isolated, paranoid, and less like the boy he once was. His soldiers will begin to whisper, his friends to fear him, and his ties to his roots will fray further. And it all began with a drunken night, an honest word, and a moment of irretrievable rage. This is a lesson for all of us, not just leaders. How much are your values worth under pressure? How do you react when someone speaks a truth you'd rather not hear? Do you listen and reflect, or do you attack and silence them? Clytus attempted a brave deed. He tried to save his friend from the monster he was becoming. He failed. By then, Alexander was too far gone to be saved. Or perhaps being held accountable felt like betrayal to him, for he had grown accustomed to adoration. Both are tragic after killing Cletus. There was no one left around Alexander like Cletus. No one dared to speak the truth anymore. So he was surrounded by flatterers, cowards, and opportunists who told him everything he wanted to hear. He was the greatest. He was a god. He could never be wrong. And in that echo chamber, he grew increasingly detached from reality until he ultimately lost everything. But that was still years away. Now, in 328 BC, after killing his friend, Alexander did what he always did. He moved on, eastward, always eastward, because stopping meant thinking, and thinking meant remembering. Remembering meant feeling the full weight of what he had done. Alexander could not bear that weight. So he fled into conquest, into movement, into the next battle, the next city, the next impossible challenge. As long as he kept moving, he didn't have to face the ruins he left behind. He didn't have to face the ghost of Cletus. He didn't have to confront the question of what he was becoming. But the ghost waited, and the question had no answer. In the spring of 326 BC, Alexander crossed the Hindu Kush mountains and entered the Indian subcontinent. It was a world his soldiers had never imagined. The jungles were so dense that sunlight could barely penetrate. The animals were unfamiliar. Monkeys screeched in the trees, and snakes they had never seen slithered on the ground. The heat was oppressive, unlike the dry warmth of the Mediterranean, but humid and suffocating. The monsoon rains poured down for days on end. Their armor rusted, wounds refused to heal, and morale began to falter. Yet Alexander pressed on, driven by tales of India's wealth and its kingdoms. He was determined to conquer them. At the Hydaspes River, he encountered King Porus. Unlike Darius, Porus did not flee. He stood his ground. A giant of 7 feet, he rode atop a war elephant, commanding an army that included 200 war elephants and chariots equipped with scythes. Alexander had never encountered such a force. His horses were terrified by the scent of the elephants, and his soldiers had no experience in jungle warfare. The Hydaspes River, swollen by the monsoon, separated the two armies, with Porus waiting on the far bank, his troops arrayed in perfect formation. For days, Alexander marched his forces back and forth along the riverbank, creating noise and confusion. Porus's men grew weary from tracking his movements. It was a battle of wits. Alexander wore them down, bewildered them, and kept them guessing. Then, on a stormy night filled with thunder and lightning, Alexander made his move. He led a contingent upstream for 17 miles. Under the cover of the tempest, they crossed the river on rafts. The roar of thunder masked their noise, while flashes of lightning blinded Porus's sentinels. By dawn, Alexander had reached the opposite bank, positioning himself behind Porus's main forces. It was a moment of military genius, not achieved through brute force, but through deception, not by sheer strength, but by strategy. Porus now faced a dilemma. If he stayed put, Alexander would attack from the rear. If he moved to confront Alexander, he would expose his main army. He chose to send his son with a detachment to engage Alexander. A fatal mistake. Alexander annihilated the troops, and Porus's son fell in battle. Then the main battle commenced. Porus unleashed his war elephants. These colossal beasts charged toward the Macedonian lines. Horses panicked at their scent, and soldiers had never encountered such enormous animals. Trunks snatched men and hurled them into the air, while massive feet trampled shields and bodies alike. A scene of pure terror. But Alexander had learned from every engagement. He had devised tactics specifically for confronting war elephants. His archers targeted the mahouts, the riders commanding the beasts from their backs. Once the mahouts fell, the elephants spiraled into chaos. Without guidance, they grew frantic, turning to stampede through their own ranks. They trampled Indian soldiers, just as they had the Macedonians. Porus's secret weapon had become his catastrophe. The battle descended into chaos, mud, blood, confusion. The Macedonian phalanx held its formation, advancing inch by inch. Alexander's cavalry flanked from the sides. Porus's lines began to crumble. Yet, Porus himself did not flee. Even as his army disintegrated, even as his elephants fell, he fought on. Wounded, he remained atop his elephant, still commanding his men. In the end, he was captured. Alexander rode to meet him. Two kings stood face to face, conqueror and conquered. Alexander posed the famous question, "How do you wish to be treated?" Porus's reply was simple and dignified. As a king would treat another king. Alexander was moved by his courage and restored his kingdom to him, even expanding its territories. He made Porus an ally rather than a captive. This was Alexander at his finest: strategic brilliance, tactical innovation, and magnanimity in victory. He not only won the battle, but also won hearts. Porus, who could have become a bitter enemy, instead turned into a loyal friend. There is a lesson here for us all. Mercy is not just a moral virtue, it is strategic. By respecting Porus, Alexander transformed an enemy into an ally. By restoring his kingdom, he showed other Indian rulers that surrender did not mean destruction. This was wise governance. Yet, it was also the last time Alexander's army would follow him without reservation. After the battle, as the soldiers sat down to rest, Alexander told them his plan. They were to press onward, deeper into India. He had heard of even greater kingdoms in the Ganges Valley, armies with thousands of elephants, cities of endless wealth. He wanted to conquer them. He wanted to reach the ends of the earth. His soldiers listened, their hearts sinking. They had already marched 11,000 miles. They had fought for 8 years. They had watched friends die in deserts, mountains, and rivers. And now he wanted to go further into deeper jungles against more elephants, fighting in this endless rain. It was too much. For the first time, Alexander's army was ready to say no. The monsoon rains have persisted for 70 days. 70 days of relentless downpour. Armor rusts, leather rots, wounds refuse to heal, festering and infecting instead. The soldiers are plagued by ailments they've never known. Jungle fever, dysentery. Their feet decay within their boots, their spirits crumbling faster than their bodies. They have followed Alexander to the ends of the earth, achieved the impossible, conquered the Persian Empire, traversed distances they once thought impassable. And now he demands more. Always more. Whispers begin to circulate, in the tents, by the fires. Has he lost his mind? Will he ever halt? Must they perish in this jungle, thousands of miles from home, for a king whose hunger knows no bounds? Then Coenus rose to his feet. Coenus was one of Alexander's most loyal commanders. He had been there from the very beginning. He had fought in every major battle. If anyone had earned the right to speak, it was him. Standing before the assembly of the army, his voice was steady and clear. "Your Majesty, your soldiers are no cowards. We have proven it to you 1,000 times. We have bled for you, risked death for you, done everything any army has ever done for a king. But we are weary. We wish to see our homes before we die. We long to hold our children. We desire to be laid to rest in the soil of Macedonia. Lead us home, and you will still be the greatest king in history. Lead us onward, and you will be a king without an army." The room fell into a deep silence. Then the soldiers began to nod. Soon, murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd, which quickly swelled into shouts of support for Coenus. They had reached their limit. They yearned to return home. Alexander stood there, stunned. This had never occurred before. His soldiers had never defied him. They had followed him across rivers, over mountains, and through deserts without a word of refusal. But now they were saying no. His face flushed with anger, his fists clenched tightly. In a fury, he stormed out of the assembly and burst into his tent, locking the door behind him. For 3 days, Alexander refused to emerge. He offered sacrifices to the gods, pleading for a sign to press onward. The omens were unfavorable. The priests declared the gods' disapproval, but Alexander cared not for the words of the gods. He cared that his soldiers had turned against him. He cared that, for the first time, his will alone was not enough to make men follow. He cared that he had reached the limits of his legend. In that tent, during those 3 days, Alexander confronted the truth he had spent his entire life fleeing. He was not a god, he was a man. And men have limits. His soldiers had limits. Even he had limits, though he had never acknowledged them. On the 3rd day, he appeared. His face was like stone. He stood before the army and spoke a single sentence. We turned back, that was it. No speech, no argument. No attempt to change their minds. Just simple acceptance, or perhaps reluctant submission. The soldiers cheered. They wept with relief. But Alexander did not cheer. He turned away, his shoulders tight. This is the most important lesson we can learn from Alexander's life. Even the greatest leaders eventually reach the limit of what people are willing to sacrifice for their vision. Ambition without consensus is tyranny. Alexander had crossed the line from inspiration to obsession, and for the first time in his life, he was forced to retreat, not by enemies, but by friends. The Hyphasis River became the farthest boundary of Alexander's empire. There he erected massive stone pillars to mark the place he had reached. But they were not monuments to victory. They were monuments to failure, not military defeat, but a deeper kind of failure. The failure of a man whose ambition had outrun the willingness of those he led. The failure of a dreamer unable to make his followers share his vision. Alexander wanted to reach the ends of the earth. He wanted to conquer everything. But he learned that you cannot conquer everything by will alone. Some obstacles are not armies. Some obstacles are human limitations, weariness, homesickness, the simple desire for life. These were things even Alexander the Great could not conquer. After being humiliated by his own army, Alexander turned south. If he could not march eastward, he would conquer his way back. He would show every Indian tribe the price of refusing him. This was no longer strategy. It was revenge. It was the fury of a man told no by his own people. The Malian tribe refused to surrender. They retreated to their fortified city. Alexander laid siege to it. It should have been a straightforward blockade, starve them until they surrendered. But Alexander could not wait. He was too enraged, too desperate to prove he remained invincible. He ordered the assault. As the ladder was set against the city wall, the soldiers hesitated. The wall was towering, the defenders well prepared, and the mission seemed suicidal. Alexander noticed their hesitation and did what he always did. He climbed the ladder himself. If his men wouldn't follow, he would go alone. But that was Alexander. He couldn't bear to appear weak or be seen as fearful. So he ascended, arrows raining down around him. Upon reaching the top, he did something that stunned everyone. He leaped inside the walls, into the city. Only 3 companions followed his jump. The rest of the soldiers, scrambling to reach the ladder, watched in horror. Their king was now within the walls, surrounded by thousands of enemies, with just 3 men at his side. The Macedonian warriors encircled them. Alexander and his 3 companions fought with their backs against the city wall. Arrows rained down upon them. Then, a single arrow 6 feet long, shot from an Indian warbow, struck Alexander in the chest. It pierced his breastplate, slid between his ribs, and lodged near his lung. He collapsed, blood gushing from the wound. His companions shielded him, striving to protect him. Outside the walls, the soldiers saw their king fall. They believed him dead. Rage consumed them. A frenzied, grief-stricken fury. They shattered the gates. They stormed into the city. What followed was not a battle. It was a massacre. Macedonian soldiers slaughtered every living being in the city. Men, women, children, dogs, livestock, everything. Their king lay in a pool of blood, and they answered with bloodshed. This was not ordered by Alexander. It wasn't even war. It was grief transformed into mass murder. When the carnage ended, the city had become a graveyard. Alexander was alive, but barely. An arrow remained lodged in his chest. The army physicians warned that removing it would kill him. Alexander commanded them to extract it regardless. He would rather die by the surgeon's hand than perish from cowardice. They cut into his flesh, drew out the arrow, and blood gushed forth. For days, he hovered between life and death. Outside, the army waited, convinced their king had departed. But he survived. Because that is what Alexander does. He survives. He survives things he should never have survived when he was strong enough to stand. He had himself presented to the army. They needed to see he was alive. Rumors had spread that he was dead, and the empire was crumbling, so he stood. So weak, he could barely remain upright, supported by his soldiers. But alive, his men wept, some out of relief, some because they realized he had nearly been killed by his own recklessness. This is the dark lesson we learn from Alexander. Recklessness disguised as courage. Alexander's need to prove himself had become suicidal. He leaped into that city not out of strategic necessity, but because his authority had been questioned at the Hyphasis River, and he needed to show everyone that he was still the bravest of all. But at what cost? He nearly died. His soldiers slaughtered an entire city. The blood of Mali is on his hands, not due to military necessity, but because of his ego. A leader who feels their authority slipping will take ever greater risks to reassert dominance. It's a death spiral. Alexander was entering that spiral. The Hyphasis River showed him he had limits. Mali showed him that denying those limits could kill him. But did he learn the lesson? No, he couldn't. Because admitting limits meant admitting he wasn't a god. And by this point, Alexander's entire identity was built on divinity, on invincibility, on doing the impossible. If he admitted he was merely human, he was nothing. So he marched on, with wounds that wouldn't heal, with soldiers who no longer fully trusted him toward a future that would only grow more painful. In the spring of 324 BC, Alexander returned to Susa, the heart of Persia, where he orchestrated one of history's most extraordinary events, a mass wedding. On the same day, 10,000 of his soldiers married Persian women. Alexander himself took 2 more wives, Statira, the daughter of Darius, and Parysatis, the daughter of Artaxerxes III, while his first wife, Roxana, remained behind. This was more than political theater. It marked the culmination of Alexander's boldest experiment. He aimed to create a new breed of humanity, a fusion of Greeks and Persians. He called them his successors, a hybrid generation destined to inherit his unified world. The idea was revolutionary in the 4th century BC. Racial integration, cultural blending, breaking barriers through marriage and bloodlines. But here lies the issue. The soldiers did not want this. They hadn't fought for it. They fought to conquer the barbarians, not to intermarry with them. They did not love these Persian women. They didn't even know their names. These were not unions of choice, but of command. Alexander provided generous dowries for each marriage, covering all expenses and turning it into a grand state affair. Yet, you cannot buy genuine integration. You cannot command love. Many soldiers participated in the ceremonies because refusal meant insubordination. But in their hearts, they resented it. As soon as the wedding ceremony concluded, Alexander turned his back, and many soldiers abandoned their brides. They viewed these women as burdens, as foreign customs they were forced to endure. From Alexander's perspective, it was heartbreaking. He had given them an empire. He had bestowed upon them wealth. He attempted to impart a vision that transcended tribalism. Yet they rejected it. This is the crucial lesson we learn from Alexander. His vision was centuries ahead of its time. 2 millennia later, we are still grappling with cultural integration, racial equality, and the triumph of internationalism over nationalism. Alexander sought to address these issues in the 4th century BC. He failed, but not because his vision was flawed. He failed because cultural integration cannot be forced. Integration takes time. It requires choice. It demands mutual respect. Forced uniformity often breeds resentment. Alexander attempted in a decade what should have taken generations. He tried to create a new culture through decrees and marriages. But culture doesn't work that way. People need to choose change for themselves. They need to see the value in another culture, not because they are told, but because they experience it. Alexander understood the intellectual part of this. That's why he studied Persian customs, wore Persian clothing, and honored Persian traditions. But he failed to grasp that forcing others to do the same would backfire. When you enforce inclusion, it ceases to be inclusion. It becomes oppression, merely wearing a different mask. Several months after the Susa weddings, a crisis erupted in the city of Opis. Alexander announced that he would discharge his veteran soldiers, sending them home with generous bonuses. This should have been welcome news. These men had been fighting for over a decade. They should have cheered. Instead, they mutinied. They shouted, "Send all of us home. Go fight your war with your Persians. Go to your father, Amun." This wasn't about going home. It was about a decade of accumulated grievances. It was about watching their king become a stranger. It was about the feeling of being replaced by Persians. It was about fighting and bleeding for a man who was no longer one of them. Alexander erupted. He leaped from the platform into the crowd and seized the ringleader with his own hands. 13 men were executed on the spot. No trial, no defense. Only instant death. Then he did something even more brutal. He turned to the army and delivered a speech that would shatter them. "You wish to abandon me? Go then, return home and tell them how you deserted your king, leaving him alone among the barbarians he conquered for you. Tell them how you turned your backs on Philip's son." He roared, then spun around and strode away. He locked himself in the palace, refusing to see any Macedonian, for 2 days and 2 nights, without a morsel of food. Outside the palace, the army began to weep, literally weep. Veterans who had fought for a decade sat in the dust and sobbed. They pleaded for forgiveness, promising to do anything, refusing to leave him. It was a masterpiece of emotional manipulation. Alexander knew how to control his men, not through force, though he had shown that too, but by making them feel like children rejected by a disappointed father. He turned their anger into guilt, their legitimate grievances into betrayal, and it worked. 2 days later, Alexander emerged. He forgave them, hosting a grand reconciliation banquet for 9,000 guests, Macedonians and Persians seated together, and prayed for harmony between the two peoples. But is this victory, or does it reveal something deeper? Alexander no longer leads through inspiration. He leads through manipulation, through fear and guilt. The soldiers at Opus did not follow him because they believed in his vision. They followed him because defying him was too terrifying. This is the lesson we learn. Charisma and guilt can control people, but only for a time. Alexander no longer leads volunteers. He manipulates weary soldiers with emotional blackmail. The line between inspiration and exploitation has blurred. Once lost, trust can never be fully restored. After Opus, the Macedonians obeyed Alexander, but they no longer loved him, not as they once did. Fear had replaced love, and an empire built on fear is built on sand. If Alexander ever loved anyone, it was Hephaestion. They had been together since childhood, studying under Aristotle at Mysa, fighting side by side at the Granicus, traversing deserts and mountains. Hephaestion was more than just a general to Alexander, more than a friend. If ancient sources are to be believed, he was his lover. His other half. He was the only one who remembered the boy before the myth, the only one who could speak the truth to him without fear. At least after Clytus's death, he was the sole person who made Alexander feel human. In the autumn of 324 BC, after a banquet, Hephaestion fell ill with a fever, possibly typhoid or malaria. For days, physicians labored over him, while Alexander refused to leave his side. But Hephaestion did not recover. He grew worse. Then, on an October morning, he died. Alexander's reaction was not one of mourning. That would have been too mild. He wailed, not wept, but howled. He threw himself upon the body, clinging to it for a day and a night, refusing to let go. The guards had to drag him away. Then he did terrible things. He ordered the execution of Hephaestion's physician. He cut off his own hair, following the Persian tradition of mourning. He commanded the entire empire to enter a period of mourning. He ordered the demolition of the battlements of nearby temples as a sign of grief, an act of sacrilege. Then he did something even worse. He dispatched his army to attack the neighboring Cassian tribe, not for any wrongdoing on their part, but as a sacrifice in honor of Hephaestion. The entire tribe was massacred, men, women, and children. This was not warfare. It was human sacrifice. Alexander called it an offering to his friend. He planned to construct a mausoleum costing the equivalent of 1,000 tons of gold, a monument larger than any pyramid. This marked a complete breakdown. The man who had studied philosophy and reason became a monster upon losing his beloved. This reveals a crucial truth we must understand. Even great leaders are vulnerable to personal loss. When they lack healthy coping mechanisms, they can drag entire nations into suffering. Alexander needed Hephaestion, not just for friendship, but because Hephaestion kept him sane. Hephaestion was his link to his childhood, to the man he was before he became a god. Now that link was broken. Since Hephaestion's death, Alexander was different. He became more withdrawn, more irritable, more difficult to be around. He began to drink more frequently. His judgment worsened. He started seeing conspiracies and betrayals where there were none. He began punishing minor offenses as if they were treason. Hephaestion's death stripped away what remained of Alexander's humanity. After that, there was only the myth, only the legend. The man was gone. This is a crucial lesson about leaders and human vulnerability. Position does not shield you from loss. Power does not protect you from sorrow. The difference lies in the fact that when you grieve, your decisions affect millions. Alexander needed a support system, healthy ways to grieve, and advisors who could tell him to stop. But he was surrounded by people who feared him or sought to profit from his grief. So his sorrow turned into violence. His loss became genocide, and thousands paid with their lives for his inability to process emotions. What do we learn from this? Leaders are human. They will lose loved ones. They will grieve. The question is, what systems do you have in place to protect your mission and your people from harm when you cannot control your emotions. Alexander had no such system, so his pain became the pain of others. After Hephaestion's death, Alexander began to drink more heavily. He had always enjoyed wine, but now it became something else, an escape. The nightly symposia grew longer and more intoxicated. He would drink until dawn, make decisions in his cups, and issue execution orders under the influence. His generals grew concerned. This was not the man they had followed. The one who rose before dawn, trained before his soldiers, and led with clarity. Now he slept till noon, woke with a hangover, and started drinking again. The combination of alcohol, grief, isolation, and absolute power proved lethal. Yet no one could stop him. No one dared to try. He pressed on with his plans, new campaigns, the conquest of Arabia, circumnavigating Africa, invading the western Mediterranean, constructing 1,000 warships, building roads across North Africa. These were not strategic blueprints, they were fantasies, the dreams of a man who could not afford to stop. For stopping meant thinking, and thinking meant feeling. And Alexander could no longer bear to feel. He had lost too much. Clytus, Parmenion, his bond with his soldiers, his Macedonian identity, and now Hephaestion. What remained around him? Flatterers, opportunists, Persian nobles drawn to his power, rather than the man himself. Macedonian generals, who followed out of fear, not love. He had built the largest empire the world had ever seen. Yet, never had he been so utterly alone. This is the ultimate lesson of unchecked ambition. You can win everything yet lose yourself. Alexander conquered lands stretching from Greece to India, but in the process he lost all that had humanized him, his friends, his principles, his identity, and his connection to reality. By the spring of 323 BC, Alexander was 32 years old. He ruled the largest empire in the world and was worshipped as a god by millions. Yet, when alone at night, lying in his opulent bedroom in Babylon, he was merely a broken man. A boy who had once been a king, then a god, now no longer knew what he was. Empty, lost, haunted by ghosts, consumed by regret, addicted to alcohol, alienated from everyone who had ever cared for him. He had reached the ends of the earth. But there, all he found was himself. And that self was a stranger he no longer recognized. Let us set aside the grand campaigns and imperial politics for a moment, and look at Alexander the man, for beneath the conqueror's armor, beneath the layers of myth, there was a real human being, with habits, quirks, fears, and dreams. How did he live day to day? How did he think? What made him laugh? What made him weep? Alexander typically woke before dawn. It was a habit instilled in him by his father. Philip, a king should never sleep later than his soldiers. He would spend an hour training, even after he became master of the known world. Swordplay, wrestling, running. He believed physical fitness was essential to mental sharpness. His body was his instrument, and he kept that instrument honed. His personal habits were surprisingly simple, at least in the early years. He slept in the same tents as his soldiers, ate the same food, and rejected most luxuries. This was no performance. It was genuine. He believed that, if he expected his soldiers to endure hardships, he must share those hardships. But as the years passed, this began to change. The wealth of Persia tempted him. The palaces of Babylon, the treasuries of Persepolis. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, he started adopting the lifestyle of those he had conquered. He began wearing Persian robes because they were more comfortable, hosting Persian-style banquets because they were more lavish, and expecting to be treated as a Persian king because he was the Persian king. His veterans noticed this. They saw their king growing soft, foreign, distant. It wasn't just the clothes, it was the attitude. The young Alexander would sit with his soldiers around campfires, listening to their stories, sharing jokes. The older Alexander sat on a raised platform, surrounded by Persian nobles, expecting people to bow. That's what power does. It changes you slowly. You tell yourself it's for political purposes. You need to look like a king to be treated like one. But at some point, the role becomes reality. You're no longer playing the king. You are the king. And kings do not sit with common men. Alexander's deepest bond was with Hephaestion. They had known each other since childhood. They studied together, fought together, dreamed together. Hephaestion was more than a friend. He was the only one who truly understood Alexander, the only one who remembered the boy before the myth, the only one who could speak truth to him, at least after Clytus died. When they were alone, Alexander could set aside the mask. He could admit doubt. He could express fear. He could simply be Alexander, not Alexander the Great. That is why Hephaestion's death shattered him so completely. It was not merely the loss of a friend. It was the loss of the only person with whom he could be himself. His relationship with his mother, Olympias, was complex. She gave him ambition, a thirst for greatness, and the belief that he was destined for extraordinary things. But she also gave him paranoia, a fear of betrayal, a conviction that everyone was either an enemy or a tool. They corresponded regularly. She would offer him advice, often concerning who should be promoted and who should be eliminated. In Macedonia, she played power games, removing rivals and consolidating her grandson's position. Alexander loved her, but he also feared her. He knew what she was capable of. He suspected she had played a role in his father's murder, and that suspicion cast a shadow between them, never discussed, yet never forgotten. His relationship with Roxana was more complex. Did he marry her for love or politics? Perhaps both. She was beautiful. She represented the fusion of East and West. But he married other women as well. The daughters of Darius, the daughters of Artaxerxes. These were not marriages of love. They were alliances. And Roxana knew this. She watched her husband collect wives as he collected provinces. When she became pregnant, he was overjoyed, an heir continuity. But he was not there with her. He was always planning the next campaign, chasing the next horizon. She bore him a son, but that son never saw his father rule, only saw his father die. What did Alexander fear? He never admitted to fear, yet it was there beneath the surface. He feared mediocrity. He feared being forgotten. He feared his life would pass without meaning. That is why he could not stop. Why after every victory he needed another. Because to stop meant facing the question, is this enough? Have I done enough? The answer was always no. It was never enough. He also feared betrayal. This fear grew worse after his father's murder. If Philip, mighty Philip, could be killed by his own guards, then anyone could be killed. So Alexander saw conspiracies everywhere after Clytus. That paranoia became delusion. He began to see betrayals that he began to strike first at perceived threats. He became dangerous, not because of his strength, but because of his fear. His greatest fear might have been losing himself. As the years passed and the legend grew, the real Alexander vanished beneath the myth. People no longer saw him. They saw Alexander the Great, son of Zeus, conqueror of the world. But who was he? Where had the boy from Myeza gone? Where was the student of Homer? Where was the young warrior who nearly died at Granicus? They were buried beneath layers of expectations, titles, and legends. Sometimes, in quiet moments, I think Alexander wondered, what would remain if he stripped everything away? If he stopped being all he had to become? He feared the answer might be nothing. But let us not forget that Alexander was more than just a warrior. He was a student of Aristotle. He was an intellectual. driven by an insatiable curiosity about the world. During his campaigns, he traveled with geographers, historians, and scientists, eager to document everything he encountered and understand the cultures he conquered. When he met the naked philosophers in India, the sages meditating under trees, he sat down and conversed with them. He asked them about life, death, and happiness. They, in turn, questioned why he sought conquest if he was not content. He had no good answer. He sent expeditions to explore unknown lands. He wanted to know where the boundaries of the world lay, where the oceans led, and whether there were places humanity had yet to reach. This was not merely conquest. It was genuine curiosity. He collected plants and animals from every place he visited. He sent them back to Greece so that Aristotle could study them. He founded cities not just as military outposts, but as centers of knowledge. He wanted libraries, schools, theaters. He wanted to preserve and spread knowledge. That is the irony. If Alexander had used his mind instead of his sword, he could have been one of history's greatest teachers. But he could not separate them. For him, conquering and learning were the same impulse. To understand was to control. Let's talk about his body. By the age of 30, Alexander's body was a map of scars, the head wound from the Granicus River, where an axe nearly killed him, the chest wound at Mali, where an arrow pierced his lung, countless other scars on his legs, arms, and back. Each one should have killed him. Each one made him a little slower, a little weaker, a little closer to death. By the time he died at 32, doctors said his body was like that of a 60-year. Old war consumed him. Not just the wounds, but also the constant marches. Illness, recurring bouts of malaria and dysentery, infections in the swamps of India, dehydration in the deserts of Persia. Then there was alcohol. Alexander drank more and more, especially after Hephaestion's death. This was not social drinking. It was self-medication. Numbing the pain, quieting the fears, escaping the ghosts. Ancient sources say he could drink twice as much as an ordinary man without appearing drunk. But that was not an advantage. It was alcoholism. His liver was struggling. His judgment was impaired. His moods grew volatile. Alcohol, combined with old wounds, recurring bouts of malaria, and the relentless pressure of never resting, was killing him. When the fever came in Babylon, his body had little left to fight it. He was already exhausted. This is what makes Alexander so fascinating. He embodies contradictions. He could show incredible mercy to the defeated Porus, yet order the massacre of entire tribes as sacrifices. He could dream of a world of cultural harmony, yet burn down a palace in a fit of rage. He could be a loyal friend, yet kill the man who once saved his life. He could be a brilliant strategist, yet make reckless decisions that nearly cost him his life. Which one is the real Alexander? The answer is all of them. Humans are not consistent. We contain multitudes. We are different people in different situations. Pressure brings out the best and worst in us. Alexander faced pressures greater than most could ever imagine, and that pressure brought forth both genius and monster. There were moments in his life, I believe, when he saw what he was becoming and feared it. After killing Cletus, after being denied at the Hyphasis River, after nearly dying at Mali. In those moments, I think he wanted to stop. He wanted to turn back. He wanted to be anything but the monster he had become. But he couldn't. Because stopping meant admitting it was all for nothing. All the conquests, all the sacrifices, all the friends lost and lives destroyed. What if he stopped and realized it wasn't worth it? So he kept going, because moving forward was the only thing he knew how to do. This is what we learn from understanding Alexander the man. Not just the legend. Achievement does not equal happiness. Power does not equal peace. Fame does not equal fulfillment. Alexander possessed everything a mortal could have: wealth, power, glory. His name will be remembered for millennia. But was he happy? I don't think so. I believe he was one of the unhappiest people in history, because he had everything except what truly matters: genuine connection, being loved for who he was, rather than what he did. The ability to pause without feeling worthless, and peace within himself. You can conquer the world, yet lose your soul. You can win every battle, but lose the war of your life. If you could travel back in time and speak to the young Alexander under the olive trees of Mysa, before he began his conquest of the world, what would you tell him? Slow down. Enjoy the journey. Cherish your friends. Know when enough is enough. Learn to make peace with your achievements, instead of always chasing more. But would he listen? Or would he treat your advice like that of the Chaldean priests, dismiss it with scorn, and do as he pleased? Perhaps some people are born to be unsaved from themselves. Perhaps Alexander had to burn bright and fast. Maybe that was the only way of life he knew. But perhaps, just perhaps, if someone had said the right words at the right moment, he could have chosen a different path. A less spectacular, but more humane one. A path leading to fewer conquests, but more peace. We will never know. But it is worth imagining, because perhaps by imagining the different choices he could have made, we learn to make better choices for ourselves. After Alexander's death, his empire immediately plunged into the chaos historians call the Wars of the Diadochi, from 323 BC to 281 BC. 40 years of bloodshed ensued. Alexander's generals, once brothers in arms, became mortal enemies. Ptolemy seized Egypt, establishing a dynasty that would rule until Cleopatra. Seleucus took control of much of Asia, from Syria to the Indus River. Antigonus attempted to reunify the entire empire, dreaming of becoming the sole successor, but he was defeated and killed by a coalition of other Diadochi at the Battle of Ipsus in 301 BC. By 281 BC, when the last major Diadochus died, Alexander's dream of a unified world had shattered completely. Adinda's family became pawns in the power struggle. Roxana and her son, Alexander III, were first placed under house arrest, ostensibly for protection, but in reality as prisoners. In 310 BC, when the boy was only 13, they were quietly executed. Thus, Alexander's bloodline came to an end. Olympias, his ambitious mother, attempted to secure power for her grandson, but was stoned to death by Cassander's soldiers. In 316 BC, as she died, she cried out that she was Alexander's mother, but no one cared. Power had already passed into new hands. Even Alexander's corpse became a trophy. Initially, there were plans to bury him in Macedonia, but Ptolemy hijacked the funeral procession and took the body to Egypt. Why? Because possessing Alexander's body meant possessing legitimacy. Whoever guarded the remains of the great conqueror claimed to be his true successor. Ptolemy preserved Alexander's body in Alexandria, displaying it in a golden coffin for pilgrims and conquerors to visit. Julius Caesar came to pay his respects. Augustus visited as well, reportedly accidentally breaking its nose. Yet centuries later, the remains vanished, lost to history, much like his empire. But something strange happened here. Alexander's political empire died, yet what he inadvertently created began to grow. The Hellenistic Age. The term comes from the Greek word Hellenizon, meaning to act like a Greek. But the Hellenistic Age was more than just Hellenization. It was a fusion of Greek, Persian, Egyptian, Babylonian, and Indian traditions. It was the cultural blending Alexander dreamed of. But it happened naturally, not through force, but through contact and exchange. In the 3 centuries after his death, from Spain to India, a shared culture began to take shape. Alexandria became the symbol of this new world. The city, the only truly prosperous one among the more than 70 he founded in Egypt, emerged as the intellectual capital of the ancient world. Its library, established by Ptolemy, eventually housed 500,000 scrolls. This was not merely a matter of quantity. It was about the origins of these scrolls. Greek philosophy, Egyptian medicine, Babylonian astronomy, Jewish law, Persian history, Indian mathematics. For the first time, all these intellectual traditions were gathered under one roof. Scholars could compare, synthesize, and create new knowledge. Here, the Torah was first translated into Greek, creating the Septuagint, which made Jewish thought accessible to the non-Jewish world. Here, Euclid wrote Phalements, a book that would be used for 2,000 years. Here, Eratosthenes calculated the Earth's circumference with an error of only 2%. Here, the ideas of Archimedes spread to the known world. This was not Alexander's plan. He was too busy fighting to build a library, but it was a direct result of the connections he created. By linking East and West, he made this exchange of knowledge possible. Greek became the lingua franca from Spain to India, not because anyone forced it. Alexander never issued a decree declaring Greek the official language. It spread because it was useful. If you wanted to do business, you needed Greek. If you wanted to read the latest science, you needed Greek. If you wanted an education, you needed Greek. This created something unprecedented, a knowledge class that could communicate across vast distances. Philosophers in Athens could debate with scientists in Alexandria. Astronomers in Babylon could share discoveries with mathematicians in Syria. The speed and scope of the flow of ideas were unparalleled. But this was not a one-way street. Greek absorbed vocabulary from all the languages it encountered. Scientific terms came from Egypt, mathematical concepts from Babylon, philosophical ideas from Persia. The language itself became a manifestation of cultural fusion. When you spoke Hellenistic Greek, you weren't just speaking Greek. You were speaking a blend of dozens of cultures. This was Alexander's dream, a universal culture transcending origins. Yet, it emerged organically, not by force. Art underwent a revolutionary transformation. Classical Greek art was idealized, perfect, and devoid of emotion. Think of the statues of the Parthenon. Beautiful, yet detached. Hellenistic art erupted with feeling, the contorted agony in Phalaoco, Phane and his sons Phae, the tragedy in Phaethi, dying Gaul Phae, the motion and wind in Phae-winged victory of Samothrace. These were not serene deities. They were human beings with emotions, suffering, and desires. What changed Eastern influences? Persian art had always been more emotional. Egyptian art had always been more dynamic. When these traditions met Greek technique, something new emerged. The most extreme example comes from Gandhara in modern-day Pakistan. There, Greek sculptors began creating images of the Buddha. Before this, the Buddha had never been represented in human form. But under Greek influence, he took on a physical appearance, a Buddha draped in Greek robes, a Buddha with Greek facial features, a Buddha carved with Greek techniques, yet embodying Indian spirituality. This Gandharan artistic style spread to China, Japan, and Korea. Today, when you see a statue of the Buddha, you are witnessing the legacy of Hellenistic cultural fusion. Alexander never reached China, but his cultural influence did, through chains of connection forged by artists, merchants, and monks. The Hellenistic era was the golden age of science. Why? Because knowledge was no longer confined by geography or language. Archimedes could build upon Babylonian mathematics. Eratosthenes could utilize Egyptian measurements. Hipparchus could access Babylonian astronomical observations. This cross-pollination of knowledge led to an explosion of innovation. Euclid's Phaelements systematized Greek and Egyptian mathematical knowledge. Archimedes discovered the principles of buoyancy, the laws of leverage, and methods for calculating pi. Eratosthenes not only calculated the Earth's circumference, but also mapped the known world from Britain to Sri Lanka. Engineering also flourished. The Pharos Lighthouse of Alexandria, one of the 7 wonders of the world, stood at a height of 400 feet. Its light could be seen from 30 miles away. This was more than just an architectural marvel. It was a fusion of Greek engineering, Egyptian labor, and an understanding of international trade. The lighthouse served ships from across the Mediterranean and the Indian Ocean, standing as a literal symbol of the interconnected world of the Hellenistic era. From its height, one could glimpse the entire known world. Religions also began to merge. Ptolemy I created Serapis, a new deity combining the Greek Zeus, the Egyptian Osiris, and the underworld god Hades. This was not a god from any single tradition. It was a deity designed for a multicultural empire. Greeks could worship him as Zeus. Egyptians could worship him as Osiris. Everyone found something they recognized, yet it was something new. This religious syncretism spread throughout the Hellenistic world. Gods crossed boundaries. The worship of Isis spread from Egypt to Rome. Mithras traveled from Persia to the west. Religion was no longer local. It became international. Philosophy also underwent a transformation. Classical Greek philosophy, represented by Plato and Aristotle, focused on the ideal state and metaphysics. Hellenistic philosophy became more personal. Stoicism taught inner peace in a chaotic world. Epicureanism taught the pursuit of happiness through simple pleasures. Cynicism taught the rejection of material wealth. Why this shift? Because Alexander's conquests created an urbanized, mobile, and uncertain world. The old loyalties to the city-state had faded. People needed new ways to find meaning. These philosophies provided answers, not about how to govern a state, but about how to live in a world beyond one's control. These ideas would profoundly influence later Christian and Islamic thought. Trade routes expanded to unprecedented extents. Alexander's conquests opened pathways between East and West. The cities he founded became commercial hubs. Ai Khanom in Bactria connected Greek merchants with Indian caravans. Antioch in Syria served as a gateway to Persia and Mesopotamia. Most importantly, Alexandria emerged as the nexus linking Mediterranean and Indian Ocean trade. Chinese silk reached Rome. Indian spices arrived in Greece. Egyptian papyrus made its way to Babylon. Arabian frankincense traveled to Macedonia. This was more than just a trade in luxuries. It was an exchange of ideas, technologies, crops, animals, and diseases. The world was shrinking. Currency standardization contributed to this. Alexander introduced a common monetary system based on the Athenian standard. After his death, this system endured from Spain to India. Merchants could conduct transactions using interchangeable currency. This greatly facilitated commerce. No longer did one need to exchange money in every city. No longer was bartering necessary. The monetary economy operated on an unprecedented scale. This created a class of wealthy merchants whose wealth came from trade rather than land. This created an urban middle class. This transformed the social structure. Alexander did not intend this, but his empire created the infrastructure for economic integration. This is the irony. Alexander sought to create a unified political empire under his rule, and that of his successors, he failed. His empire fractured almost immediately after his death. Yet, unintentionally, he created something far more enduring. A world of cultural and economic unity, even amid political division. It became a world where ideas flowed freely, where art, science, philosophy, and religion crossed borders and sparked new syntheses. What he tried to impose by the sword emerged naturally through trade, education, and cultural exchange. The cosmopolitan world he envisioned was not achieved through conquest. It was realized through the connections forged by his conquests. If you could tell Alexander this, in Babylon, as he lay on his deathbed, if you could say that his military empire would die, but his cultural legacy would last 3 centuries and shape both Western and Eastern civilizations, would he be comforted or disappointed? I think he would feel conflicted, because he wanted to be remembered as a conqueror, as a king, as a god. But his greatest achievement was something he never intended. He was a bridge, even if a violently built one, connecting worlds that had been separate. Once that bridge was built, ideas, goods, and people began to cross it. And that flow changed everything. After Alexander's death, his empire immediately plunged into the chaos historians call the Wars of the Diadochi. From 323 BC to 281 BC, 40 years of bloodshed. Alexander's generals, once brothers, in arms, became mortal enemies. Ptolemy seized Egypt, founding a dynasty that would rule until Cleopatra. Seleucus took control of much of Asia, from Syria to India. Antigonus attempted to reunify the entire empire but failed, dying at the Battle of Ipsus. By the time the last major successor died in 281 BC, Alexander's dream of a unified world had fractured into countless small kingdoms, each claiming to be the true heir to his legacy, yet none embodying his vision. Alexander's family became pawns and then victims. Roxana and her son Alexander IV were imprisoned and then murdered in 310 BC. The boy was only 13. He never ruled anything, inheriting only his father's name and a death sentence. Olympias, Alexander's ambitious mother, attempted to seize power for her grandson and was stoned to death by Cassander's soldiers. In 316 BC, Alexander's body became a trophy. Ptolemy stole it and brought it to Egypt, where it was displayed in a golden coffin for centuries. Julius Caesar came to visit it. Augustus came to visit it. But in the end, it vanished, lost to history, much like Alexander's dream. Yet there is an irony here. Although Alexander's political empire perished, he achieved something far more enduring than he could have imagined. He ushered in the Hellenistic age for 3 centuries. From his death until the Roman conquest, Greek culture blended with Eastern traditions to create something new. Alexandria, the city he founded in Egypt, became the intellectual capital of the world. Its library housed 500,000 scrolls. Its lighthouse was one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. Euclid wrote his geometry there. Eratosthenes calculated the Earth's circumference. The ideas of Archimedes spread from its shores. This was not accomplished through force, but through the free exchange of ideas. Greek became the lingua franca from the Mediterranean to India, not because anyone forced it, but because it became useful. If you wanted to do business, study science, or read philosophy, you needed Greek. The spread of this language sparked an unprecedented exchange of ideas. Buddhist texts were translated into Greek. Greek philosophy spread to India. Persian astronomy blended with Greek mathematics. Art underwent a transformation. Greek realism merged with Eastern motifs. You got Buddha statues that showed emotion and movement, sculptures displaying foreign features, architecture in blended styles. This was the cultural fusion Alexander dreamed of. But it happened naturally, not by decree, but through contact and exchange. Trade routes expanded. Alexander's conquests opened pathways between East and West. The precursors to the Silk Road began to take shape. Goods, ideas, and technologies flowed across broader ranges than ever before. This was not Alexander's plan. He did not think, I will establish trade routes to promote cultural exchange. But by conquering these territories and by founding cities that connected them, he created the infrastructure for such exchange. This is an important lesson we learn from Alexander. Military conquests fade. Political empires collapse. but cultural exchange endures. The ideas you spread outlast the territories you control. Alexander is not remembered for the lands he conquered. He is remembered for the cultures he connected. He is remembered because he, even through violence and imperialism, demonstrated that different civilizations can learn from one another. Alexander shows us that ambition is a fire. It can illuminate the world. It can inspire impossible achievements. It can push humanity beyond the limits they believe exist. But fire also burns. It consumes left unchecked. It can destroy everything it touches, including the one who holds it. Alexander refused to accept impossibility that allowed him to conquer empires, but he also refused to accept enough that left him to die alone, haunted by dreams he could never fulfill. This is the question for everyone with ambition. Where is your Hyphasis river? Do you know the point at which to turn back? Can you recognize the difference between pushing forward and protecting what you have already gained? Or will you, like Alexander, chase the horizon until there is nothing left to chase, only to find emptiness waiting for you at the edge of the world? Alexander taught us the paradoxical nature of leadership. He showed us what true leadership looks like. Lead from the front. Share the risks you ask others to take. Inspire rather than command. Respect your enemies. Be generous to the defeated. Adapt to new circumstances. Learn from every experience. These are timeless lessons in leadership, as relevant today as they were in the 4th century BC. But he also warned us where leadership can go wrong. What happens when you stop listening? What happens when you surround yourself with yes men? What happens when you kill the truth tellers? What happens when you start believing your own myth? Alexander transformed from an inspirational leader into a manipulative tyrant. Not overnight, but gradually, with every unchallenged decision, every outburst of rage that went unpunished, every choice to rule by fear rather than love. This is a lesson for everyone in a position of leadership. Surround yourself with people who will tell you the truth. Seek criticism even when it hurts. Build systems to protect your mission when your judgment fails, because it will. Everyone's does. The question is what happens when you fail? Will someone stop you? Or will everyone be too afraid to speak up, letting your mistake become a disaster? After Alexander killed Clitus, no one dared to tell him the truth again. That was the moment he lost. Not his empire, he kept that, but his humanity. Remember this: the more you achieve, the fewer honest voices you will have around you. Success creates insulation. Unless you actively fight against it, unless you reward dissent instead of punishing it, unless you value truth over comfort. Alexander's vision of cultural fusion was radical in the 4th century BC. In some ways, it remains radical today. He imagined a world where birth no longer mattered. Only merit did. Race and culture were not barriers, but differences that could enrich rather than diminish. It is a beautiful vision. It is a vision worth pursuing. But he taught us that you cannot force it. You cannot command people to abandon their identities. You cannot create harmony by decree. The mass wedding at Susa failed not because the idea was wrong, but because the execution was flawed. True cultural fusion takes time. It requires choice. It requires mutual respect. It requires both cultures to see the value in each other. Alexander attempted in a decade what should have taken generations. He tried to force the evolution of what must occur naturally, and forced inclusion is no longer inclusion. It becomes another form of oppression. We still grapple with these questions today. How do we respect differences while building common ground? How do we encourage integration without imposing assimilation? How do we let cultures coexist without one dominating? Alexander had no answers to these questions. But he showed us what does not work. What does not work is a conqueror telling the conquered that adopting his culture is for their own good. What does not work is ordering people to love one another. What is work is creating spaces for encounter, trade, education, art, science. When people choose to engage on their own terms, that is where Alexander's true legacy lies, not in forced marriages, but in the Library of Alexandria, not on battlefields, but in marketplaces and schools. We have witnessed the transformation of Alexander at 20, a student of Aristotle, showing mercy at the Temple of Thebes. At 26, the burner of Persepolis, intoxicated by glory. At 30, the killer of Clytus, paranoid and isolated. At 32, a grieving tyrant, ordering mass executions to mourn his friend. This trajectory is predictable. Early victories breed confidence. Confidence breeds a sense of invincibility. Invincibility breeds arrogance. Arrogance breeds isolation. Isolation breeds paranoia. Paranoia breeds cruelty. Observe this pattern. In leaders, in companies, in movements, in yourself. Power does not corrupt by making you evil. It corrupts by making you isolated. When you become so powerful that no one can reach you, you lose touch with reality. You begin to live in a world of your own echoes, and in that world, you go mad. Alexander wanted to be remembered as what? The creator of eternal unity, the king of the cosmos, the one who bridged east and west. What does history actually remember? A military genius, a conqueror, a builder, and a destroyer. But above all, a young man who tried to transcend his own mortality and failed. He founded over 70 cities, but only one truly mattered: Alexandria. And that city's legacy was not military. It was intellectual. The irony is that what Alexander created unintentionally became far more valuable than anything he ever deliberately conquered. He wanted to be remembered as the king of warriors. But he should be remembered as an accidental cultural ambassador, by connecting East and West, even through violence. He made cultural exchange possible. That exchange changed the world in ways far more profound than any battle. When Alexander wept at 30, it was not for the conquests he had lost, but for the realization that conquest itself was hollow. But what if he had lived to 50? Historians speculate he might have conquered Rome, Arabia, and Carthage. Yet others suggest a darker possibility. He was already drinking himself to death. His arrow wounds never fully healed. His body was breaking down. More importantly, his mind was unraveling. Paranoia, alcoholism, emotional instability. Had he lived another 20 years, what would we remember? Perhaps Alexander did not die too young. Perhaps he died at the right moment. Before his empire crumbled under his own instability. Before his soldiers truly rebelled. Before the drinking and paranoia turned him into something we would no longer recognize. He died a legend. Had he lived to 50, he might have died a villain in his own story. Sometimes legacies are preserved by timing. Live long enough and you risk the hero's journey turning into a cautionary tale. Alexander died at his peak. Yes, he was broken. Yes, he was lonely. Yes, he was haunted. But he never lived to see the empire fully crumble. He never became an unrecognizable monster. He died while he could still be called great, even with all the complexity. Perhaps that was his final stroke of luck. Not what he achieved, but that he died before losing everything completely. Alexander's story is not ancient history for today. It is modern. Every tech CEO who says move fast and break things is channeling Alexander's aggressive expansion. Cult of personality belief that the rules don't apply. It is the same pattern. The question is, are you building something sustainable, or are you charging toward the cliff like Alexander? Do you have a succession plan, or will your company collapse the moment you leave? Are you building systems, or building something that depends on your charisma, Amazon without Bezos, Apple after Jobs, Microsoft after Gates. Truly great founders build systems that outlast them. Alexander only built himself. For activists and idealists, Alexander reminds us that the means become part of the ends. You cannot achieve a peaceful vision with violent methods, because violence poisons the vision. How you arrive determines where you arrive. For anyone with ambition, Alexander's question becomes your own. What are you willing to sacrifice for your goals, your health, your relationships, your morals? At what point does the sacrifice outweigh the value of the achievement? The Hyphasis River principle, knowing when to turn back. The greatest strength lies not in charging through every barrier, but in recognizing which battles are not worth fighting. Alexander never learned this. It destroyed him. Where is your Hyphasis River? Can you recognize it? Or will you press on as he did, until there is nothing left to press toward, only to find emptiness waiting at the end? Remember, Alexander conquered the world, but lost himself. That is not victory. It is history's most costly defeat. So what have we learned from Alexander the Great? We've learned that boldness opens doors, but kicking them down recklessly destroys what lies within. We've learned that vision without restraint is merely obsession in finer wrapping. We've learned that conquering others is easier than conquering oneself. And the second battle is the one that truly matters. We've learned that legacy isn't measured in territory. Alexander's empire lasted a decade, but his ideas, cultural fusion, the spread of knowledge, the belief that barriers are meant to be crossed, those echoes have never faded. We've learned that greatness and goodness are not the same. Alexander was great, but was he good? History still debates. Above all, we've learned that you can change the world and lose yourself. Alexander conquered from Greece to India, yet he never conquered his own ego, his own hunger, his own need for validation. He won 1,000 battles on the field, but he lost the war for his soul. The real question is not whether you will achieve great things. It is what you will sacrifice to attain them. Will you still recognize yourself when you get there? Alexander teaches us to dream the impossible, but he also teaches us to know when to stop, to listen to the voices of those who love you, to choose sustainability over spectacle, and perhaps the wisdom to say, enough. Before the world forces you to, the greatest empire you can build is not made of territory. It is made of ideas that outlive you, of relationships that keep you grounded, of principles you refuse to compromise, and perhaps the courage to turn back before it is too late. Alexander the Great died at 32, yet the questions of what made him great and what made him tragic will endure as long as humanity dreams of glory. If you could travel back in time to Miaza, to the boy reading Homer beneath the olive tree, what would you tell him? Stop, turn back, choose a different path. Or was the impulse to advance, the need to prove everything, the dream of becoming immortal, woven so deeply into his soul that it could not be unraveled? Perhaps Alexander had no choice. Perhaps he was born to burn bright and fast. Perhaps his tragedy was not the choices he made, but that his very nature left him unable to choose otherwise. Or perhaps that is the story we tell ourselves to avoid facing a harder truth. We all have choices every day, every moment. To advance or to turn back, to conquer or to connect, to become myth or to remain human. Alexander made his choice. Now, it is your turn to make yours. Thank you for accompanying me on this journey through history. If you found value in Alexander's story, consider which lessons from his life you will apply and which you will avoid. The ancient world is full of such tales, patterns of power, trajectories of ambition. Human nature never changes. Until next time, remember, history does not repeat itself, but it rhymes. The patterns of power, ambition, and humanity remain the same 2,000 years later. Studying the past is not about living in it. It's about making better choices in the present. Alexander showed us the heights one person's will can reach, but he also showed us the cost of getting there. Now the choice is in your hands. What will you build? What will you sacrifice? And most importantly, will you know when to say enough? That's a question Alexander could never answer, but perhaps you can. For 2,300 years, each generation has reinvented Alexander. Ancient Greeks saw him as a demigod hero, the heir of Achilles. Romans viewed him as a model conqueror to emulate. Medieval Christians transformed him into a saint who spread civilization to barbarian lands. Islamic scholars called him Qarnayn, the two-horned one who appears in the Quran. Enlightenment thinkers regarded him as a disseminator of reason. Romantics saw him as a tragic hero. 20th century scholars debated whether he was an imperialist or a cosmopolitan. Every era has reshaped Alexander in its own image. This tells us more about ourselves than about him. In Alexander, we see what we wish to see: hero or villain, visionary or madman, liberator or oppressor. So which one is true? The answer is none, or all of them. Because historical figures are not singular truths. They are complex human beings who appear different from various perspectives. What you emphasize determines the story you see. Emphasize his military genius, and you get a great conqueror. Emphasize his cultural policies, and you get a visionary unifier. Emphasize the massacres at Tyre and Thebes, and you get a cruel tyrant. Emphasize his inspiration to his soldiers, and you get a great leader. Emphasize the murder of Clytus, and you get a paranoid killer. All of these are true. All of these are Alexander. One of the historical controversies surrounding Alexander was he Greek or Macedonian? This question still sparks intense political debate today. Modern Greeks claim Alexander as Greek. The Republic of North Macedonia asserts he is their national hero. The ancient truth is more complex. Macedonia was a peripheral kingdom in antiquity. They spoke a dialect of Greek. They worshipped Greek gods. However, Athenians did not regard them as true Greeks, labeling them as semi-barbarians. Alexander himself was sensitive to this. He made great efforts to prove his Greekness, claiming ancestry from Argos, emphasizing his education, and promoting Greek culture. Yet, he was also the king of Macedonia, fighting for Macedonian interests, employing Macedonian tactics, and relying on Macedonian soldiers. The truth is that Alexander transcended simple categorization. By the end of his life, he was neither purely Greek nor purely Macedonian. He was both and neither. He forged a new identity, that of a Hellenistic cosmopolitan. But this meant everyone laid claim to him, for he did not fully belong to anyone. This is what we learn from this controversy. Identity is fluid. People can belong to multiple cultures. Attempting to fit complex human beings into neat boxes always fails. Alexander fit into no box. That was his strength and his curse. The second historical controversy about Alexander was he homosexual, bisexual, or heterosexual? Ancient sources hint at, but never explicitly state a sexual relationship between Alexander and Hephaestion. They use the language of Achilles and Patroclus, a relationship that was unambiguously sexual in antiquity. Yet, no ancient author directly says Alexander and Hephaestion were lovers. They say he loved him most, he trusted him most. When Hephaestion died, he grieved to the point of madness. He had wives, at least 3. He had concubines. He had a son. So what was he? Modern scholars debate endlessly. Some say he was clearly homosexual or bisexual. Others argue that ancient gender categories differ from modern ones, and contemporary labels cannot be applied. This is the truth. In ancient Greece and Macedonia, gender categories were different from ours. Intense emotional and physical relationships between men were normal, especially in military settings. This does not mean everyone was what we today call gay or bisexual. It means their categories were different. The line between friendship and love was blurred. Two men could be deeply emotionally and physically intimate without being defined by our modern terms. So, when we ask about Alexander's sexual orientation, we are asking a question that would have been meaningless to him. He did not identify as anything. He simply lived, loved, and followed the norms of his culture. What we can say is that Hephaestion was more important to him than any of his wives. Their bond was the most significant relationship in his life. How you choose to label it is up to you. Historical controversy about Alexander the Great. Did he aim to conquer the world or unify cultures? This is the greatest debate surrounding Alexander. Was he primarily a conqueror driven by a thirst for power? Or did he genuinely believe in cultural integration and the coexistence of East and West? Some historians argue that his cultural policies were merely pragmatic. He needed Persians to accept his rule, so he adopted their customs. Benevolence was a tool, not a belief. Others contend otherwise, suggesting he truly embraced cosmopolitanism and sought to create a new, unified civilization. The Susa weddings, the appointment of Persian satraps, and the adoption of Persian court rituals were not just strategies. They were expressions of a genuine vision. I believe the answer is both. Humans are not purely motivated. We are driven by multiple desires simultaneously. Alexander wanted power. He wanted glory. He wanted to be remembered. He wanted to prove himself greater than his father. All of these are true. But he also genuinely believed in the superiority of Greek culture. He believed spreading it was a good thing. He believed different peoples could coexist if organized in the right way. These beliefs do not cancel out the violence of conquest. They make it more complex. He was neither a simple villain nor a simple hero. He was an imperialist who believed his imperialism was enlightened. That is the most dangerous kind, because it wraps violence in noble intentions. Historical controversy about Alexander the Great IV. Was he poisoned? From the moment of his death, rumors began to swirl. Was he poisoned? The list of suspects is long. Antipater, the regent of Macedonia, had a strained relationship with Alexander, Antipater's sons, one of whom was the royal cupbearer, had the opportunity. Olympias, his mother, though it is unclear why she would kill her son. Persian nobles seeking revenge. Generals wanting to end endless campaigns. Ancient sources mention poison. They describe symptoms, gradual paralysis, intense pain, a slow death. Some modern scholars believe this aligns with certain plant toxins. However, most modern historians doubt this. They point out that Alexander's health was already in poor condition. Years of campaigning, repeated bouts of malaria. The wound from Mali never fully healed. Heavy drinking. His body was a ticking time bomb. When he fell ill in Babylon, the most likely explanations were typhoid fever, malaria, or some kind of fever that his weakened body could no longer fight off. The poisoning theory is thrilling. It turns his death into a murder mystery, rather than a tragic inevitability. But it may not be true. Sometimes great men die like ordinary people, from illness, from time, from the limitations of their own bodies. No conspiracy. Just biology. That is almost sadder. Most of the stories we hear about Alexander come from Greek and Macedonian sources. But how do the Persians remember him? Few Persian records have survived, but those we have paint a very different picture. To them, Alexander was a destroyer. He burned Persepolis, erasing 2 centuries of art and history. He slaughtered Persian nobles. He ended the Achaemenid Empire, which had ruled for 2 centuries. Yes, he married a Persian wife. Yes, he adopted Persian customs. But that did not make up for the destruction. Imagine your civilization being destroyed by a foreign conqueror, and then that conqueror puts on your clothes and claims it was for your own good. That is not an honor. It is an insult. In Indian tradition, Alexander barely exists. He came. He met Porus. He left. His impact was minimal, because he never penetrated deep into the Indian interior. He did not conquer major kingdoms. He did not alter the course of Indian history. To Indian historians, Alexander is a footnote. This teaches us something important. Western history sees Alexander as a world-changing figure. But most of the world hardly noticed him. China did not know him. Japan did not know him. Sub-Saharan Africa did not know him. The Americas did not know him. What we consider global history is actually highly regional. Alexander changed the Mediterranean world and the Middle East. But he did not change the world. Remember this. It keeps you humble. In Islamic tradition, Alexander became Dot Cornain, the two-horned one, a righteous king mentioned in the Quran. He built a wall to protect civilization from Gog and Magog, traveled to the ends of the earth in search of the fountain of life. This Alexander bears little resemblance to the historical Alexander. Yet it shows how stories transform across cultures. Each culture adopts historical figures and adapts them to its own values and narratives. The Arabic Alexander is wisdom, justice, and exploration. The Greek Alexander is conquest, glory, and tragedy. Are they the same person? In one sense, no. In another, both capture certain aspects of the historical Alexander. Alexander the Great has been politically appropriated in modern times. Nationalists invoke him to support their territorial claims. Greece and North Macedonia have contested his legacy. Dictators compare themselves to him to justify their conquests. Napoleon studied him. Hitler admired him. Every tyrant with ambitions of conquest has looked at Alexander and seen a reflection of themselves. But this is dangerous, because Alexander lived in a different world. Warfare in the 4th century BC was not the same as modern warfare. Imperialism in the 4th century BC was not the same as modern colonialism. Attempting to justify modern policies through Alexander's example is an abuse of history. Popular culture has also distorted Alexander. Hollywood films portray him as a handsome hero, simplifying his contradictions. Video games let you play as him, conquering the world without moral consequences. These depictions are entertaining, but they erase complexity. They make conquest seem glorious without showing the cost. They show battles, but not the aftermath of slaughter. They show Alexander winning, but not the soldiers bleeding and dying. If we learn anything from Alexander, it should be that we need complexity. We need to see the whole picture, the good and the bad, the heroism and the horror, the genius and the madness. Seeing only one side gives us the wrong lessons. The final question: should we judge Alexander by our modern moral standards? He was a monster. He committed genocide. He killed tens of thousands. He destroyed civilizations. He owned slaves. He was a dictator. But by the standards of his time, he was a great conqueror who did nothing his contemporaries considered unusual. So, which standard do we use? Some historians say we must judge historical figures in context. We cannot expect people from the 4th century BCE to have 21st century morals. Others say no, certain actions are always wrong regardless of the era. Genocide is wrong, murder is wrong, no matter when or where it occurs. I believe the truth lies somewhere in between. Yes, we must understand the historical context. War in the 4th century BCE was brutal. Conquest was the norm. Slavery was widespread. Alexander was no worse than his contemporaries, and in some ways, better. But that cannot serve as an excuse. Understanding is not forgiveness. We can comprehend why he did what he did while still condemning the actions themselves. We can admire his genius while mourning his victims. We can learn from his successes while rejecting his methods. That is what it means to engage with history, not to simply judge it as good or bad, but to understand its complexity and draw lessons that remain relevant today. Finally, what did Alexander leave us? Not his empire, which crumbled immediately after his death. Not his cities, most of which have vanished or changed beyond recognition. Not his political systems, which lasted a few decades and then faded away. What he left us is something more abstract. He left us the example that the impossible can be accomplished. For better or worse, he demonstrated how one person's will, combined with the right circumstances and enough luck, can alter the course of history. He left us the first real attempt at blending Eastern and Western cultures. Even though it failed, it planted the seeds for later endeavors. The Hellenistic age, the Silk Road, modern globalization. All of these have roots in the connections Alexander opened. He left us with questions about ambition and achievement, questions about means and ends, questions about culture and identity, questions about leadership and power, questions about what we are willing to sacrifice for our dreams. There are no easy answers to these questions. Alexander cannot give us the answers. He did not know them himself. But by asking these questions, by wrestling with his life and choices, we think more deeply about our own lives and choices. That is the purpose of history. Not to memorize dates and facts, but to use the past to illuminate the present, to use the mistakes of others to avoid our own, to use the achievements of others to inspire our own. So when you think of Alexander the Great, what do you see? A hero or a villain, a genius or a madman, a visionary or a tyrant? Your answer tells me something about him, but it tells me even more about you, about what you value, about what you fear, about what you long for. Alexander, like all great historical figures, is a mirror. We see our own reflection in him, our ambitions, our fears, our yearning for meaning, our need to be remembered. His life raises questions we all must answer. What is enough? What makes a life worthwhile? What are we willing to sacrifice for success? How do we balance dreams and reality, ambition and humanity, achievement and contentment? Alexander could not answer these questions. He died at 32, still chasing, still conquering, still proving, never stopping, never satisfied. But perhaps his failure can teach us about success. Perhaps his tragedy can help us avoid our own. Perhaps by seeing someone who had everything but lost himself, we can learn to cherish the right things. Not conquest, not glory, not being remembered by history, but being remembered by those we love, for who we are, not what we have done, for the love we give, not the achievements we claim, for the world we leave behind, not the territories we conquer. This is the story of Alexander the Great, a boy who changed the world in 13 years, a man who died at 32, defeated by an enemy he could not conquer, his own humanity. What have we learned from him? We have learned the power and price of ambition. We have learned that leadership can inspire and destroy. We have learned the dream of cultural fusion and the danger of forced unity. We have learned how power corrupts not by making you evil, but by isolating you. We have learned that you can conquer the world and lose your soul. We have learned that greatness and goodness are not the same. We have learned that, sometimes, the greatest courage is not charging forward, but knowing when to turn back. We have learned that legacy lies not in how much you conquered, but in what you left behind. But most importantly, we learned this. Alexander's story is not just about him. It is about all of us, about the choices we all face, to advance or to halt, to conquer or to connect, to become a legend or to remain human. Alexander made his choice. He chose to advance. He chose to conquer. He chose legend. He got what he wanted. His name will be remembered as long as humanity tells stories. but he lost everything that truly mattered: his friends, his peace, his very self. Now, it is your turn to choose. Will you learn from his example? Will you dream big, but stay grounded? Will you pursue excellence without sacrificing your humanity? Will you know your own Hyphasis river and have the courage to turn back? These are questions only you can answer. Alexander cannot answer them for you. History cannot answer them for you. Only you, in your own life, facing your own choices, can decide what matters to you. But when you make those choices, remember Alexander. Remember the lessons he taught us, both bright and dark. Remember that achievement is not happiness. Power is not peace. Being remembered by history is not as important as being remembered by those you love. Conquering the world is not as meaningful as conquering yourself. Being the greatest is not as noble as being your best. This is why we tell the story of Alexander 2,300 years after his death. Not because we want to be him, but because we want to learn from him, from his successes and his failures, from his genius and his madness, from what he did right and what he did wrong. History is not the corpse of the past. It is a living conversation across centuries where the dead speak to the living. If we are willing to listen, Alexander is speaking to us. He is saying, "Look at what I achieved, but also look at what it cost me. Learn from both. Use both. Do better than I did." If I could send a message about Alexander to be read 1,000 years from now, what would it say? Perhaps this: Alexander the Great showed us the limits of human potential, both the heights we can reach and the depths to which we can fall. He proved that the impossible can be done, but he also proved that doing the impossible cannot fill the emptiness within. He taught us to dream big, but also to know when a dream is big enough. He showed us how leadership can inspire people to go places they never thought possible. But he also showed us what happens when a leader stops listening. He tried to build bridges between cultures. He failed because he tried to build that bridge with a sword. But his failure paved the way for later successes. This is Alexander's legacy, not his empire. That vanished, not his conquests. Those were forgotten, but the dialogue he began. A dialogue about how different cultures can coexist, about ambition and morality, about how an individual can and should try to change the world. That dialogue continues. 2,300 years after his death, it will continue long after we are gone, because the questions Alexander raised are eternal. As long as humans have ambition, dreams, and the desire to leave a mark, Alexander's story will remain relevant. As long as we struggle between greatness and goodness, between ambition and ethics, between personal achievement and collective well-being, we will return to Alexander for lessons. So now I present you with a challenge. After this story ends, take a moment to reflect, not about Alexander, but about yourself. Ask yourself these questions. Where is my Hyphasis river? Where is that point in my life where I need to turn back instead of pushing forward? What am I chasing? Is it something truly important or empty achievements? What am I sacrificing for ambition, my relationships, my health, my principles, myself? How do I measure success? By what I have or by who I am? By what I conquer or by what I connect? By my reputation or by my character? If you continue on your current path, where will you end up? On some mountaintop, successful but alone, like Alexander? Or in a place less spectacular but more real, surrounded by people who truly know and love you? There are no wrong answers, but there are honest answers and dishonest ones. Alexander never answered these questions honestly. He told himself he was doing great things for the right reasons. But deep down, I think he knew the truth. He was running from emptiness, running from doubt, running from the question. If I stop, who am I? Don't make the same mistake. Don't wait until it's too late to ask these questions. Don't wait until you stand in your own Babylon 32 years old, dying of fever, realizing what you traded your life for. Alexander the Great died in 323 BC, but his story lives on. It lives in everyone who dreams big dreams, in everyone who wants to change the world, in everyone who struggles between ambition and humanity, in everyone who must decide what truly matters. His story lives in you, in your choices, in your dreams, in your struggles. You don't have to repeat his mistakes. You can learn from his lessons. You can dream big, but stay grounded. You can pursue excellence without losing yourself. You can change the world without destroying it. You can be great and be kind. You can. If you choose, if you remember, if you learn. So, this is the story of Alexander the Great. From the flames of the Macedonian palace to the deathbed in Babylon. From a 9-year-old boy to a legend at 32. From the son of Philip to the conqueror of the world. From man to myth and back to man again. It is a story of ambition and its price, of dreams and delusions, of achievements and emptiness, of a man who conquered everything but himself. Yet, it is not just his story. It is our story. The story of everyone who has ever dreamed, of everyone who has ever chased, of everyone who has ever wondered if it was enough. Alexander's answer was no, never enough. I hope your answer is different. I hope you find you're enough. I hope you conquer your own demons instead of conquering the world. Because in the end, this was the lesson Alexander never learned. Success is not measured by how much you conquer, but by how much you connect. Greatness is not about how people remember your name, but about how you make them feel. A legacy is not built on the empires you construct, but on the lives you touch. Alexander built one of the largest empires in history. Yet, when he died alone. Haunted by ghosts, disconnected from all that truly matters. Don't let that be your story. Don't trade your humanity for achievement. Don't trade your soul for success. Don't trade the people who love you for strangers who love your name. Alexander made that trade. It broke him. Learn from his mistakes. Do better. Live better. Love better. Be better. Thank you for accompanying me on this journey through the life of Alexander the Great 2,300 years. 32 years of life, a man who changed the course of history. But still, just a man with dreams and fears, with strengths and flaws, with triumphs and failures, just like all of us. If you remember only one thing from this story, remember this. You don't have to be Alexander the Great to live a meaningful life. You don't have to conquer the world to leave a mark. You don't have to become a legend to matter. Sometimes, the greatest courage is choosing a small but meaningful life over a grand but empty one. Sometimes, the greatest achievement is being remembered by those you love, rather than by history. Sometimes, the greatest victory is conquering your own demons instead of conquering kingdoms. The story of Alexander will be told as long as humans tell stories. It will be reinterpreted, reimagined, and used for new purposes. Each generation will see something different in him. Each generation will learn different lessons from him. This is good. This is how history should work, not as a collection of dead facts, but as an active dialogue with the past. Alexander speaks to us, we respond. We agree, disagree, learn, and argue. Then, we pass the story to the next generation, who will do the same. This is how meaning is transmitted through time. This is how the past teaches the This is how a man who died in 323 BC Street speaks to us today. So move forward, carry the lessons of Alexander, carry his warnings and his inspiration. Dream big dreams, but dream the right dreams. Pursue excellence, but not at the cost of your soul. Change the world, but first change yourself. Be great, but first be good. Leave a legacy, but let it be a legacy of love and connection, not of conquest and fear. And when you reach your own Hyphasis river, when your followers beg you to turn back, have the courage to listen. For the greatest leaders know when to advance, but the wisest leaders know when to stop. Alexander never learned the latter. He paid everything for it, but you can. You can do better. You can learn from his mistakes. You can realize his vision without repeating his tragedy. You can, and I hope you will. This is what we can learn from the life of Alexander the Great. This is his legacy. Not the lands he conquered, but the questions he raised. Not the empire he built, but the dialogue he began. Not the legend he became, but the lessons he left behind. Thank you for listening. Thank you for thinking. Thank you for learning from the past so you can make better choices for the future. History remembers Alexander the Great, but it doesn't have to remember you as great. Only that those who love you remember you as good. Sometimes that is the only legacy that truly matters. Now, go write your own story, learn from Alexander. But do not become him. Be better. Be wiser. Be the best version of yourself. That is enough. That is everything.